Hello, Tolkien geeks, and welcome back to Voice of Geekdom Live. I'm your host, Dan, and I've got two spectacular guests today. I'm very lucky to have both of these fine people with me, two of my favorite Tolkien YouTubers. We've got previous podcast guests, Lexi, aka Girl Next Gondor, still my favorite Middle-earth Tolkien YouTube channel name. And we've got my good friend Robert, who I was just on his stream last week. Some of you may have seen. Had a great time. And Robert kindly agreed to come and return the favour and appear on my channel. And today we're here to talk about Feyenoor. Some of the people in the chat 2 weeks ago asked for a stream on Feyenoor, and I immediately thought I'll ask Robert, since he voiced the character for me, did such a wonderful job of it.
I just embody Crazy Elf. What can I say?
Yeah. Well, it's fun, isn't it? Getting to portray a sort of villain like that, and sort of let your inner darkness out like that. And I know Lexi is a big fan of the Noldor and a big stan of Feyenoor, so it just made sense to invite you too. So yes, thank you both for coming.
We're very grateful for the opportunity. I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk about Feyenoor.
I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be with you wonderful people, so thank you.
I'm just having a look at the chat here, and we've got some of the regulars. We've got Canadian Fantasy Corner, who I think is another YouTuber. I've not watched any of their content, but check them out. Got my good friend Kelly, the moderator. We've got Indie Geek in the chat, famous YouTuber, everybody. We've got Helen the Clueless Fangirl, our mutual friend. Hayley Cates, another regular. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out today. It's good to see everybody. We've got lots of Patreon questions to get through today. A few more than I had 2 weeks ago, which is good news. People are getting into the swing of asking questions, and we've got some really good ones, some tough ones. So we'll get straight into those as soon as possible. Fëanor is a character who divides opinion amongst the Tolkien fandom, I would say. I remember when I first got into the shout out to the Prancing Pony podcast. When I got into the Prancing Pony podcast and they were doing their Silmarillion breakdowns, they talked about how, Fëanor is kind of a villain and he's not somebody that you're supposed to necessarily sympathize with. And they got lots and lots and lots and lots of fan mail from lots of people telling them that, no, actually he's their hero and that he stands for, such and such, like he frees the Noldor and he's a great liberator and he's this Promethean sort of character. And people love him. People love to hate him, or people just unironically love him. And Lexi, I'm going to go to you on this one because I think you're a little bit of a Fëanor stan and possibly come into that camp. He was said to have been the greatest of all the children of Ilúvatar. And it's mentioned in the Silmarillion that the Valar mourned his marring by Melkor due to the things that he could have gone on to achieve if Arda wasn't marred and Fëanor wasn't marred. He was supposed to have been this great unifying figure who would have gone on to achieve great things. I'm going to start out with a little reading of that section from the Silmarillion, from chapter 11, I want to say. And so I'm just going to launch into it here. And they mourned not more for the death of the trees than for the marring of Fëanor, of the works of Melkor, one of the most evil. For Fëanor was made the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor, in endurance, in beauty, in understanding, in skill, in strength, and in subtlety alike, of all the children of Ilúvatar, and a bright flame was in him. The works of wonder for the glory of Arda that he might otherwise have wrought, only Manwë might in some measure conceive. And it was told by the Vanyar, who held vigil with the Valar, that when the messengers declared to Manwë the answers of Fëanor to his heralds, Manwë wept and bowed his head. But at that last word of Fëanor, that at the least the Noldor should do deeds to live in song forever, he raised his head, as one that hears a voice far off, and he said, So shall it be. Dear bought those songs shall be accounted, and yet shall be well bought, for the price could be no other. Thus, even as Eru spoke to us, shall beauty not before conceived be brought into Ea, and evil yet be good to have been. So, as I say, the Tolkien fandom has its Feyenoor apologists, and we're going to get into that right now. You often hear the catchphrase, Feyenoor did nothing wrong, which is sort of one of those phrases that is only really said about characters who did plenty wrong. But how should we see Feyenoor? How do you guys see Feyenoor? Should we see it the same way that Manwë does? Should we mourn for him? Is he a sort of tragic figure? I'm gonna start with you, Lexi, because I know you have some strong opinions about Feyenoor.
You know, Eru saved me. I love the little guy. So there are some people who take the unironic view that Fëanor did nothing. I mean, I think this is probably a pretty limited subset of the fandom as a whole, but there are some people who would argue that the Valar being kind of indifferent, maybe being too isolationist, Fëanor really counteracted, very, very much counteracted a lot of that tendency, and for that reason, his choices and his actions, even the ones with negative consequences, should be viewed as, you know, admirable, worth imitating. I don't quite fall into that camp. I'm kind of the centrist that views Fëanor as being super, super fascinating, first of all, from just a literary perspective in terms of his personality, the traits that he might have, his strengths and his this great potential for good that you mentioned, but also this tendency toward maybe a lack of wisdom. I hesitate to say outright evil, because as poorly as some of his choices went, he remains an elf and an elf of Valinor, and desperately, desperately opposed to Morgoth to his very last breath. So misguided, seriously misguided, and definitely riddled with flaws and sins and all of that. But I hesitate to classify him as outright evil, because from his perspective, he's still working towards something that he considers good. The overthrow of Morgoth and justice and safety and liberty and all of those ideals are, I think, in and of themselves good and worth striving for. I think Helen can probably sympathize with this. She and I both kind of have a reputation now, because we both rather enjoy contemplating the darker characters, the Dark Lords, Morgoth, Sauron, that kind of thing. We think that they're interesting characters, and so if someone says, oh, who's your favorite Vala, we might flippantly in the moment answer, well, Morgoth is, or Melkor is, and people kind of tend to be taken aback by that, because those are very, very evil characters who do very, very bad things. And the explanation for that is that, at least for me, I won't speak for anyone else, but for me at least, that duality that's present, and Tolkien does a really good job of presenting this duality in both his noble and his ignoble and his middling characters, between tendencies toward evil but also striving towards something good, and how that plays out in a variety of different ways, again, throughout the whole spectrum of good versus evil, selfless versus selfish. So for me, Fëanor encapsulates all of that very nicely. And then part of the problem too is that I was a romantic child when I was a young high schooler struggling my way through Paradise Lost. I developed a crush on Satan. I'm known for my Morgoth standing and my Sauron standing, so it's just sort of a natural. I'll even make some limited points in defense of Maeghlin and Eol if my back is up to the wall. So it's kind of natural that I would be drawn toward the Byronic Fëanor, who's bent on self-destruction, but gosh, does he make it look good. So that's my opening remarks.
Cool. Yeah, you're definitely somebody with unusual tastes in that way. I've noticed.
It might be a chick thing. I'm not sure.
And so, Robert, how about yourself? You voiced Fëanor for me. How did that experience make you feel differently about Fëanor, if at all? And what are your views on him as a character?
Well, I I really like him. I just to say to Lexi, I think you're supposed to like Satan in Paradise Lost. I think so. I completely forgive you for that. It's written with that in mind. In my view, anyway. But the sympathy there, I think, is there because you're supposed to. I think you're supposed to see. I'm going off into Paradise Lost now, which is not what you asked me about. But in terms of Fëanor, I think it's the same thing. Fëanor for me is the most interesting character among the elves in that first period, and that's deliberate on Tolkien's part. The elves in Valinor are, let's face it, a bit dull when they're there, and that's right. They're supposed to be. This is a sort of a paradise on earth, and things don't die, nothing bad happens. This is all good, nothing. Therefore, there's no real tension. There's no real stories. This is why millennia pass and we don't actually get much information about what's happening in Valinor. The story kicks in when Fëanor happens. So I really like him for that, the protagonist spirit within him. Do I think of him as like an evil guy? No, but I think he did evil things. Tolkien doesn't really go for moralizing on this, but I don't think you can see anything with the kinslaying as just one example. He slaughtered a whole load of people just because he wanted their boats and they said no. That's not a good thing. I don't think there's any way we can defend that. But at the same time, and I might talk about this a little bit more, I saw one of your patron questions touch on this, but he is the instrument not just of evil, which is what the Silmarillion often presents him as being, this instrument of creating doom and death and destruction and bad things follow in his wake, which it does, but also many great and good things as well in the long term. The Noldor go back to Middle-earth because of Fëanor, and that, I would argue, has in the long run a hugely positive knock-on effect.
Yeah, good answer. I always think Fëanor is evil with a small e. You know, there's capital E evil, there's Morgoth, and there's Sauron, and there's those kinds of Dark Lord characters. But Fëanor is he's just a really, really bad guy who's not cataclysmic, cosmic evil, but he's just nasty and capricious and jealous and just a rage monster, really. So yeah, I think that's a good categorization. I want to get into the first Patreon question, which is on a related note. Should we sympathize with Fëanor? And this is actually from Reflective Rambling, long-time fan of the channel. And she says, history is written by the victors, as they say, and a good deal of the Silmarillion is clearly written with a slant. How elves see other races, for example, in an overview way when you exclude certain partnerships. But life isn't that black and white. Is there a portion to Fëanor's story, say the emphasis on his lies and prideful antagonism, that is more a result of who got to tell the story? In other words, is there space for Fëanor apologists? Or that, say, for example, the Teleri didn't deny him simply because of an admiration for their ships and possibly had their own alliance? So what she's getting at here is there room for an unreliable narrator point of view on Fëanor's deeds? I would say not, personally. I mean, there is an element of unreliable narrator going on in the Silmarillion, for sure, but I don't think this is an area where I would look at it through that lens, particularly. Any thoughts? Whoever wants to jump in, go for it.
I have thoughts.
Go for it.
So, first of all, hi, Reflective Rambling. She made me my very first fan art today on Twitter, so I'm very excited to see her here.
Yeah, she watches a lot of Tolkien channels. She's also one of Robert's patrons, I believe.
Yes, we see her around. She's a good egg.
It's also her birthday today as well, I should say. So happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. So, to answer your question on your birthday, Fëanor and apologists and historical revisionism and all of that. I think the most important thing to me that gets lost in the Silmarillion a lot of times as we're sort of reading it, because Tolkien was, of course, very sensitive to this notion of perspective. He actually calls increasing attention to that as his legendarium evolves in his later years. He frequently is writing, okay, this group of histories or annals or these dates are made by this group of people in this perspective, so it's going to be light on this and heavy on that. So it's something that he is aware of and he's playing with. He says outright in the Silmarillion, or of the Silmarillion rather, that it's one of the few non-human centric groups of legends that he can think of, because it's all told from the perspective mainly of the elves. So all of that kind of being a given. But as concerns Fëanor, I think what's important is that history is written by the victors, but also by the survivors. We're talking about elves who are theoretically immortal, and some of them, Galadriel comes to mind as a prime example. Elrond would also presumably have opinions on all of this. The Silmarillion is recounted by the people who largely agreed with some or all of Fëanor's points, even if they disliked him personally. As we know, Galadriel did intensely in Valinor, but she still follows him and supports his cause broadly of leaving Valinor, rebelling against the Valar, seeking revenge on Morgoth, and seeking liberty in their own lands in back east. So for her to have gone through what she went through, I don't think I need to summarize the first stage here, or the second, all of the very, very bad things that happened because of decisions that at the time to everyone seemed like the right decisions. I think that's something that's lost when we're, maybe reading the Silmarillion for the first time, or the Annals, and we get all this sort of narrative commentary on, well, this was a really bad idea on Fëanor's part, and you can see here that he's being moved by his pride or by his envy and not by actually what he says he's being motivated by. But at the time, most people who heard him talk thought that he at least had a point. And as far as the Teleri go, I think you can easily think of things from Fëanor's perspective without agreeing with what he did, or without thinking that there's some sort of conspiracy going on or something. You can look at things from Fëanor's perspective in the moment. He's traumatized, he's sworn this oath, he's in a realm controlled by the Valar, who are all-powerful, and he's deeply suspicious of them because of Morgoth's actions and Morgoth's, I guess, propaganda campaign against them. And he's got his people at his back, and he knows that at any moment he's going to lose them, and he's desperate, and here are the Teleri saying basically, no, you can't, you got to stop, you can't go any farther, and he knows that the Teleri are very closely allied to the Valar. You can see how, from Fëanor's perspective in that moment, he maybe seems justified to press the issue until it becomes a bloodbath. And then, retrospectively, afterward, people look back at that decision and say, that was a horrible decision, and it was. I want to be very clear on that. I do not condone kinslaying, but there is an element to which that 2020 hindsight kind of comes in, and it's necessary, I think, to... This applies, by the way, to the Valar, this applies to the Númenóreans, this applies to anyone who's commonly villainized in the Legendarium. There's a point at which you have to take their perspective. Even Arwen does this when she comes to the end of her life, and she's talking about Ar-Pharazôn and how she never understood in the past why men have made some of the decisions that they made, and now that she is in their position, it's all clear to her. She's like, oh, I get it now. So yeah, long answer to a short but good question, I guess.
No, good, thanks. Yeah, that's good. One thing I want to pick up on one thing you said there, which was about how Fëanor sways people to his point of view, and that's one of his great strengths, I think, is his ability to use rhetoric to bring people around to his way of thinking. And yeah, there are a lot of people who agree with his rebellion and join his rebellion, but do so in spite of their misgivings about him personally. But they do also respond to his arguments. And so, yeah, I think that's important to recognize about him. We had a couple of super chats already, so I'm going to get to those. Before I do, I'll just say super chats are turned on, obviously, and it's a great way to get your comment highlighted. We'll try to get through as many comments in general as possible, but it's something to bear in mind. The first one here is from Rob Slevin. And he says, Lexi, could you please explain how much hair is in a tress? Seems a lot more than Gimli's one hair request.
Well, you guys always get me. First it's how do elves smell, and now it's how much hair is in a tress. I don't know. However much hair it would take to distinguish between, okay, so if Galadriel's hair catches and combines the light of the two trees, presumably, and this is why Fëanor has a fascination with it, and what that actually is a result of her hair being almost equally split between the silver of the Teleri on her mother's side and her father's blonde inherited from his Vanyarin mother. So let's say this is a result of a near perfect 50-50 split between silver and gold hair in Galadriel's scalp, therefore minimum 2. Is my final answer.
Yeah, I think it's an archaic word for a lock of hair. I think that's the answer. I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask, but I think that's the answer. It's a lock of hair, so it's however much that is. It's a handful, essentially. And we had another super chat here, so I'll move straight on to that one. From Lyle Hammock, it's $100, very generous, thank you. Hello all on this amazing panel. What is your guys' view on how Míriel, his mother's death and absence, affected Fëanor as a character, and his antagonism toward Indis and her children? Also, hello again, Lexi. You should do another stream with Robert. I enjoyed your input. I agree with that.
Thank you, Lyle.
I think obviously Fëanor has got some big mummy issues. There's a story in one of the etymological essays about I forget the name of the character, but it looks like a slanted P, and it's an S sound that migrates to a TH sound, or no, the other way around. It's a TH sound originally that migrates to an S sound over time, and it's sort of a non-canon storyline, but Fëanor refuses to observe that change in the language that happens as a natural change in the sounds in the language over time, because his mother was opposed to it or something like this, which just shows you the degree to which he would go to preserve his mother's memory and how important that was to him. I talked about that on one of my Q&A feedback videos that I do in between chapters of the Silmarillion. So I'll try and link that in the comments at some point after this stream finishes. But Robert, do you have any thoughts on Fëanor's mother?
Some. Hi, Lyle. Hi, Reflective Rambling. Happy birthday to you. I would like to talk about Reflective Rambling's question in a moment, but I'll happily quickly talk about Míriel first. Yes, it clearly did, but I think that this it's the impact wasn't just about him not having a mother. It was the fact that his father then focused all of his attention and love and everything in on him, and I think that definitely would have fed his egomania at some level. I would have thought that if you're already the heir to be High King of the Noldor, and then you suddenly find out that actually the one parental figure in your life is devoting absolutely everything, focusing everything in on you, then it only will add to it. So I think that was quite an important point. The thing I was wanting to say just on Reflective Ramblings question, which was the one about the unreliable narrator and is history written by the victors and things like that. I think the just to follow on from the first comment I made towards the start of the stream, for me this is a matter of what is being told. We often think of being like the Silmarillion as being this sort of the history of the world, which it is. It's a history written by the elves, but not what has come down from Eru Ilúvatar. This isn't like the way that some people would say, insert holy book here, is written by God or is passed down from God. This is not what they're saying. They're saying these are lots of mysteries. So we don't get Eru's view on this. And the closest thing I think we get is, and this is my bit of prep for this, was just to take down this quote because it's one of my favorite ones. This is about the music of the Ainur right at the very beginning, before time, when everything was basically being created, and Melkor Morgoth was there sowing discord into the music. And Eru says, "No theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." Now, if you look at what happened here through this story, this is actually literally Morgoth sowing discord in Valinor. That's what's going on here. That is literally him doing what was being sung, and out of this, good things will flow. So I would say it's not so much that we've got the elves, the winners, are telling a story and sort of being an unreliable narrator. They're not seeing the big picture. They're just seeing what's the history of what happened. And understandably, the things that they wish to record are, this guy killed lots of other people and he shouldn't, and that was bad. This guy led a huge revolt and he shouldn't, and that was bad. They didn't write the theology on top of it, which says, and all of this was part of Eru Ilúvatar's big plan to get rid of Morgoth in just a few hundred years' time. That is the bigger picture. So that's how I would sort of tie all of that together, is to say, if we look at it just in terms of what actions he did, his actions, many of them were evil. But if we look in terms of how this fits into the music of the Ainur, then actually this is all part of Eru's ineffable plan.
Yeah, and that ties in with the quote that I read. The part about Manwë's response to Feanor's corruption, and how the songs that will be sung will be worth it in the end. That's basically him echoing Eru's words there in a later chapter. So yeah, that's important to recognise. One last thing on the unreliable narrator thing as well. It's worth considering as well that the most commonly accepted kind of canonical narrative frame for this is that this was Bilbo's gathering of different sources when he was during his time in Rivendell, and this was the translations from the Elvish that he gives to Frodo later, and that this was his sort of scholarly kind of aggregation of different bits of information from different sources, including from eyewitnesses in some instances, because there were elves there in Rivendell who were actually present for those events. So Bilbo would have tried to eliminate as much bias as possible, you would think, and so it comes from multiple sources, although there is noticeably an Elvish slant to it. So I think that's my last word on the unreliable narrator thing. And
Bilbo was himself quite pro-Elvish, it has to be said.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, very much so. Cool. Are there any more comments from the chat that we can pick up on, or do we have any more to say about the previous super chat? Maybe. Alexi, we didn't get your thoughts on Lyle's comment. Maybe we should go to that.
So mommy issues, Fëanor. I will attempt to restrain my many thoughts on the Finwë family dynamic. We will be here all night if I don't. I think one of the things that should be mentioned is that Miriel is the first elf to be recorded as deliberately trying to forsake bodily life. And that is just another thing that marks Fëanor out as the special one. So not only does he draw so much life from Miriel that in the text, it destroys her ability basically to find joy or to find pleasure in life anymore. It's like a case of postpartum depression on mega steroids. So she desires only to rest, which again, I'm thinking of Fëanor as the neediest newborn, needing to be held and rocked all the time, and the number of times in my life that I have thought to myself, being in similar positions, I desire only to rest. So just let me lie down here and forsake my body and go to Lorien and just sleep for, until the end of time. I think I would be cool with that. So that's how Muriel meets her end, and her body is preserved, and for a long time Finwë is waiting for her to come back, and the Valar have to do a whole thing to allow him to remarry, and Fëanor presumably would have grown up with this kind of going on around him, this issue of, you poor little boy, your mother died because you killed her by sucking all of her life force, and now you're your father's your father's favorite son, but also his only family that's left, and you know that he wanted more children, and now he's working to get more children, and oh my gosh, are you enough anymore? And it's a situation, I think, that is interesting because no one else in Valinor has gone through that, and the Valar are completely at a loss for what it might mean and how to deal with it. So I often think that if Fëanor had been put into like a little grief therapy, or maybe Finwë had to attend some family dynamics classes when he decided to integrate more members into his little nuclear unit, a lot of things could have been averted. But interestingly, I don't think anyone was aware necessarily of how that was going to work for Fëanor, whereas in humans this happens quite regularly, unfortunately, and as Elvish history goes on, similar weird family situations arise. But in Valinor at the time, it's sort of like, well, I don't know, like, what do you mean you don't have a mommy and a daddy and 2 or 3 younger siblings, and you're all going to live together happily for the rest of time? So I think that's fun. I think Fëanor is having these concerns that no one else can really address because no one else has been in that position before, as far as he knows. I'm chuckling to keep from weeping because it's also very sad, but kind of funny.
Yeah, being the original firstborn child of the first ever broken home is a big cross to bear, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
We had one more super chat. This is from Here Be Dragons, which is my friend Stephen. His channel is Here Be Dragons, so check them out. They do lots of cool content, Star Wars content. They cover the Expanse a lot, so check out that channel. He just says, all right, got to run, but I'll catch the rest on rewatch. He's in between work and playing Dungeons and Dragons, I think. So I'll see you soon. But thank you for the super chat. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next Patreon question on my list. Let me scroll down here. This is from Marco Berry, and he says, I've always wondered this about the Silmarils. Were the gems themselves created, or were they existing gems that Fëanor imbued with the light of the 2 trees? I would extend this question more generally to the other famous gems of Middle-earth, the gems in the Rings of Power, the Elfstone, the Arkhanstone, etc. Okay, so I'm going to run down his list here, starting with the Silmarils, of course. We do know that they were composed of a substance known as Silima, Silima with an M for mother. And this is according to the Glossary of Elvish Terms, which is at the back of the Silmarillion, which suggests to me that they were probably made of some kind of synthetic material. We don't know too much more than that. It's really just a short sentence that we get about that. I've always wondered whether the Palantiri were made out of the same or a very similar substance, because there is some similar properties. We do have a late coming question about the Palantiri a bit later, so maybe we'll get to that later on. But moving on here, the Rings of Power, this is not Fëanor related, but we can answer this because there is an answer. Nenya is the Ring of Adamant, which is basically just an archaic word for a diamond. So it's a diamond stone. And Vilya and Narya are set with a sapphire and a ruby, respectively, which is according to of the Rings of Power and the Third Age in the Silmarillion. And as for the other Rings of Power, we don't know. They're not described anywhere that I'm aware of. So your guess is as good as mine. The Elfstone, this is the stone that Galadriel gives to Aragorn, which is a book-only thing. It wasn't in the movies, although there was that pendant that Arwen gives Aragorn, which is sort of a stand-in for that. We don't know too much about that. My speculation about it's a green stone. We do know that much. It is actually connected to Fëanor as well, potentially, because it was said to have been possibly created by Celebrimbor, his grandson. There's 2 different versions of that history to that artifact, but My little bit of speculation about that one is that it could have been similar to the elf stone that Aragorn recovers from the last bridge in The Lord of the Rings. So there's a sequence where Aragorn finds a stone in the mud, and it's something that Glorfindel left behind for him, and he calls it a beryl, which is an actual real world classification of gemstone, which includes emeralds and aquamarine. So in my take on that is maybe it's similar to that. Certainly an emerald would make sense there. The Arkhanstone was it was said to have been the heart of the mountain, the lonely mountain that is, and it was found by Théin, the king under the mountain, who was Thorin's grandfather inside the mountain. So presumably that would mean that it's a naturally occurring gemstone. But one thing that people do like to speculate is that could it have been a Silmaril? And the answer to this is no, because it has different qualities overall. And I actually did want to throw this over to you, Robert, because I think you had a video about the Arkhanstone. Am I right in thinking?
I did, yes.
So why is the Arkhanstone not a Silmaril, and what do we know about it?
Dredging my memory now. But the main thing is that the Silmarils are hallowed, and they may not be held by the unworthy basically you have to be good and in the right place to be holding Silmaril, and people are picking up the Arkhanstone and passing it around, and nobody's going ouchie. That is enough of a clue for me that this is clearly not. But also it's different when you read the description of it, and you do get quite a good description of it when when Bilbo's there clambering over the mounds of gold, and he sees it, and yes, it does glow a bit as if it has some sort of interior light, but that is completely different to the kind of light that we have from the Silmarils. The Silmarils are bright enough to be stars. This is that they have hallowed light coming from them. So it's a completely different thing. And no, it's not. They discovered it when they were digging down under the mountain. You're on mute.
Oh. I'm on mute, yes. Yeah, so yeah, good answer. Yeah, it clearly would have burnt straight through Thorin's palms if it was a Silmaril. That gives the game away there, really, doesn't it? I would maybe add to that as well. It's possible that Tolkien was taking some inspiration from that, because when he was writing The Hobbit, he wasn't necessarily tying it in with his whole legendarium and the Silmarillion. So there are references to stuff in the Silmarillion in The Hobbit, but there are references to stuff in the Silmarillion in Rover Random, for instance. So it could be that he was inspired by that same story in some sense, but that he was not necessarily thinking that it was set in the same world, would be my answer to that as well. This is something that Lexi and I have talked about before, actually, on the channel. Was Tolkien's inspiration for The Hobbit, and the fact that things were retconned back in and things made to make sense and to be consistent in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is that although it is not a Silmaril, the Tolkien did use this, I suppose we might call it a trope for himself, this idea of this precious thing, small object, whether that's a ring of power, whether that's a Silmaril or the Arkhanstone, as a way of driving the plot forward. So it does occupy the same kind of thematic world, but isn't the exact same thing.
Yeah, the whole Legendarium can be summed up by just saying it's a series of world wars fought over jewelry, really. Pretty much. Lexi, anything to add on that?
The only thing I have to add is that further evidence against the Arkhanstone being a Silmaril is that it does develop a degree of fame, and if it were indeed a Silmaril, I would suspect that we would hear something about Maglor returning to rain destruction down upon Erebor and finally fulfill his father's and his brother's oath. And that doesn't happen, so I guess we gotta assume that it's, not a Silmaril.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Have another super chat here from Cloaked One, who says, "Congratulations on reaching 5K subscribers, Dan. That's an awesome and well-deserved achievement. Here's to the next 5K." Thank you, my friends. Yes, I appreciate that. Yeah, that happened the other night, live on air with Robert, which was very exciting. We were counting down to it, so it's, very much appreciated your shout outs for that as well, because I think that drove people to do that.
It was very well deserved, though. Well done for getting to 5,000. It's a really good achievement. I think you missed a super chat a bit earlier as well. Just people are trying to point out to you.
Did I? Which one was that then? I'm not very good at handling this chat thing at the moment. Here we go. Jared. Not to derail the stream, but Nerdinel having 7 kids and also dealing with Feyenoor deserves much acknowledgement and praise. Also blacksmithing. Dealing with Feyenoor, yes. I mean, Nerdinel, we have another question coming up about her as well. She is the first in a long line of women in the Silmarillion whose men don't listen to them. It's a bit of a kind of undercurrent theme, sort of a subtext to the whole Silmarillion. Really is women whose husbands don't listen to their advice when they really ought to. Nerdinel is a character that I absolutely love. I really adore her, and I'd like to have more stories about her. But we do have a question coming up about her, so we'll talk about that in a moment. Do you guys have anything to add about Nerdinel?
I'm saving myself. I saw the question earlier, but yes, Nerdinel is awesome. She definitely deserves high praise for doing what no other elf could do, which is to get Fëanor, even for a little bit, to stop and take a deep breath, count to 12, and think about the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, that works for a while. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting marriage.
I'll hold fire as well. Sorry.
And having 7 kids, I think that's also it's Feanor's just that potent. He's that potent of an elf. This is the largest elf. It's the largest elvish family that we know of. I think Tolkien does say somewhere that it is the largest. So yeah, definitely a notable point about Fëanor. Don't see any other super chats. Plixie Plox. Where's that one? Plixie Plox. I'm scrolling up, sorry. I don't see it. Here it is. Plixie Plox says, "Hi guys, sorry to be late. Would you mind rewinding the contestation?" I don't understand the question. Conversation, does he mean, maybe? You're free to rewind the conversation yourself if that's what you meant. I don't know if anybody has anything to say about that, but thank you for the super chat. I do appreciate it as a regular as well. It's good to see you. We had one more from Helen, the Clueless Fangirl, who says, "Theory. Fëanor went up in flames because he did not want to leave a grave and a place of worshipping behind, like we have for most other heroes." Yeah, I mean, that's definitely convenient from the point of the elves, who probably shouldn't be venerating this figure. I've just noticed the amount of 666, so thank you for that. Teenage Lexi is impressed. It's a really interesting moment with Fëanor. There's lots of fire imagery all throughout his entire story. I mean, he's got a pyromania problem. He's an arsonist all the way through. Not to mention, the torches in Tyrion during his speech, and in the end he goes up in flames, which is peculiar, to say the least. And I think it's just a mark of how special and how unique he was, but I don't really have a theory as to how and why that happened. Let's throw it to the panel. What do you guys think about Fëanor's death scene where he goes up in flames?
Well, I don't think it was him intentionally choosing the manner of his death. I don't think that was what was going on there. I think he was a spirit of fire, and he just got attacked by a mob of fiery Balrogs, and I think that the likely result of that is fire. It's just he.
But he survived for a while after that, though, because he was carried away from the battle, wasn't he?
He did, but he was mortally wounded in an attack from the Balrogs, from Gothmog. But he was a spirit of fire, and that was, I mean, I think Tolkien, yes, it's poetic language, but I think that Fëanor is different and special, and so that's what happened. I just imagine it as being like a kind of a Bruce Lee kind of internal combustion kind of. It was just he was so tightly wound up and absolutely everything that it's just the moment that his body gave in, then his spirit just erupted out.
Yeah, I called him a Promethean figure earlier on, and I think that maybe that's what's going on a symbolic level, is that it's a reversal of that kind of figure. Not to get too into Greek mythology, but I think maybe that's something to think about with Fëanor as well. Lexi, did you have any thoughts on that?
So, on the one hand, we have the fact that going up in literal flames is super dramatic and therefore peak Fëanor, but we also have the counterpoint that if he could have chosen to leave behind a grave and a shrine, as it were, to his body, that strikes me like the kind of thing that he would definitely think was pretty sweet, especially since at this moment he is forcing his sons to re-swear the oath that they have all already sworn, even though he can see he kind of has a death foresight come upon him, that he knows this is not going to end well for any of them, that Morgoth is ultimately going to triumph, that his best efforts were unavailing, and so therefore obviously no one else is going to be able to do a better job of hating Morgoth than Fëanor does. So even in that moment he makes them re-swear. He's recommitting them to make their lives basically into a living monument to his death by bringing about all of their own horrible violent deaths and the unnecessary deaths of many others. So I think that is his monument, and if he could have chosen to leave a physical monument behind by just dying in the normal way, I suspect that he would have gone with that option. So I don't think that it was ultimately a voluntary choice.
No, I don't think so either. So I think that's a unanimous no. Sorry, Helen, but good theory. Do we have any more super chats here? We've got, yes, we do. We've got Callisto_Arcas, $10. Thank you. Maedhros seems to be an even more complex character than Fëanor. Considering the internal conflicts he faces throughout his life, would you say he took on more of his mother's traits than his father's? Yes, I do. I think the red hair is symbolic of that, and I do think he's very similar to his mother. And yes, as Lexi just said, Fëanor, with his dying act, dooms his children, and you can't help but feel slightly sorry for Maedhros for having all this responsibility heaped on him, having to uphold his oath, which drives him to a horrible end in the end. And also for Maglor as well, the other second oldest brother, who by all accounts is kind of a good egg. He apart from the kinslaying, which he took part in because he felt he had no other choice because of his oath, he also kind of adopts Elrond and Elrond's brother Elros, and sort of, well, the both of them do, but you get the impression that Maglor is the one doing the real parenting. And so, yeah, these are two really horribly tragic characters who come to bad ends as a result of Fëanor's posturing and his kind of, I mean, he has this foresight, he has this dying foresight that he just completely ignores and doubles down on the whole Oath of Fëanor business, which is just, I think it's possibly the worst act of Fëanor's life, is to doom his children in that way. I mean, it's not worse than massacring a bunch of Teleri, maybe, but in some ways it is. Some ways it's more awful what he does to his children. And yeah, I do really enjoy the character of Maedhros. Yeah, definitely. Hey guys, who wants to jump in on this one? Anybody have any thoughts on Maedhros?
You go, Lexi. I'll say something afterwards.
Yeah, I'll just be real. I think that's an excellent point, that he he's in this difficult position. I also believe that, I think it's Peoples of Middle Earth is the pertinent text where he's described as inheriting a lot of his mother's appearance. He's supposedly the ginger one, along with the twins, and in that he takes after Nerdanel's side of the family, who her father is a redhead, nicknamed Fox. So he looks like Nerdanel, and I think he's mentioned as having inherited her face and her mood. I think in just the Silmarillion, where it's a little bit more high level, they do talk about how Nerdanel bequeaths her mood in part to some of her sons, but not to all of them. So there's definitely this division within the Feanorians between the ones who can kind of check themselves and take a breath and maybe put aside their emotions in the moment and think about what's best for everyone, which is Nerdanel's side of the family, the patience, the restraint, that kind of thing. And the more purely Feanorian ones, the middle children in particular, seem to have a strong dose of this. The much maligned middle children, the middle seas, all seem to have, to a degree, some impetuousness or wrath or greed or inability to set aside a grudge, and they almost always act on their worst impulses versus, again, the nice ones, Maglar, Mithros, and to an extent Amrod and Amras kind of seem like they're just swept up along in it. Yeah, so I think, basically everything you said, only more so.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to add huge amounts to that. I think the only thing I would do is say it's very noticeable he was the one who gave up the kingship. And that this is, I think, would his father have ever done that? No. Would any of his brothers have ever done that? Probably not. So there was something about him that you always get the impression that he does exactly what he has to do all the way to the end. He never even gives up having the Silmaril. He takes the Silmaril with him, and it's like he does what he's promised to do, but you never feel he's 100% bought into it. So so Nerdanel, we're told that some of her children got some of the aspects of her character, and she's called Nerdanel the Wise, which is that's the actual thing that is the moniker that's given to her. And if you had to look across Fëanor's sons and her sons, which one would you say is wise? Well, probably not any of them, but I think Maegos may well be the closest out of the seven.
Yeah, there's a sort of steely determinism to fulfill his oath there, but he's not enjoying a second of it, really. He stands aside at the burning of the ships. He doesn't take part in that. He says, no, I refuse to do this. I think he's the only one who does that. So yeah, definitely a really cool character. We did have another super chat from Cloaked One, who says, shout out to Dan's mods. Yeah, massive thank you to the mods, most of whom are also good friends of mine, so I do appreciate them showing up for me like this. Appreciate everything they're doing. Don't see any other super chats, but I've probably missed one because I'm just I think I've got them all at the moment. Okay, let's move on to the next question from Patreon then. This is the one about the father-in-law and his wife. So this is a good segue into this. So on a related note here, this is Reflective Rambling again. She says, Feyenoor adjacent, if acceptable. He was taught the art of the smith by his would-be father-in-law. His wife, I believe, was also an artisan or assisted them. Do we know anything of their own works? Or if they were at least near as skilled as Feyenoor in this area to be seen a worthy mentor? Excuse me. I remember that his wife did not follow him on his departure, but do we know more of her or her father's reaction to Feyenoor's first exile, as more attention in the Silmarillion was paid to how his own father chose his firstborn over his alliance to his other sons? So we do know a little bit more, yes. Nerdanel became estranged from Feyenoor before he left. She was a sculptor, so that's mentioned in the Silmarillion. I don't think we know a great deal about her individual works. They're not mentioned anywhere that I'm aware of, but but she was a sculptor. And it's kind of, you can kind of infer that perhaps Fëanor did learn from her in that sense. Or at least they were a kind of partnership that worked because they were both craftspeople, I think, for a while, as we said before. She tempered his more violent instincts for a long time. And as Robert said, she was Nerdinel the Wise, which, you know, he needed somebody like that, and it's a shame that she couldn't keep him under check for longer than she did. But that's the story. She also, we do know that about the two youngest sons, who Lexi just mentioned, Amrod and Amras, the two red-headed twins, who were the two youngest. She begged Fëanor to allow her to keep them at home in Valinor. She didn't want any of them going with him on his rebellion. She didn't want him going, but at the last moment, she begged him to let them stay, and he refused and took them all. And of course, they all end up dying or coming to horrible ends. And it was predicted by Mandos as well. So this was, you know, her response to that whole prophecy as well. But Fëanor just didn't have the foresight or the wisdom to listen to her. So this is basically what we know about her. One of my favorite characters, as I said before, is like this is a theme in the Silmarillion here at this point, where there's several characters. Melian also comes to mind with Thingol, women whose husbands just will not listen to their better judgment, to their better halves. I'm going to throw this one to the panel. Robert, did you have anything more to say about Nerdinel? We've already touched on her
only
a bit, but...
very briefly, which is that, and I think Lyle Hammock had a super chat requesting some more love for Nerdinel, so I shall do that. There's Nerdinel only gets, I think, 6 or 7 mentions in total by name in the Silmarillion, so we don't know huge amounts about her. But I think it says a huge amount that when talking about Fëanor, we read, for Fëanor was driven by the fire of his own heart only, working ever swiftly and alone. And he asked the aid and sought the counsel of none that dwelt in Aman, great or small, save only, and for a little while, of Nerdinel the Wise, his wife. So there is only one person that Fëanor ever sought counsel from, and that was Nerdinel. And I think that says a huge amount, that he was absolutely convinced of the strength, the strength of his own abilities and where he was going and what he was doing. But he would stop and take counsel from her at the beginning, to start with, at least.
Yeah, and also in this question here, Lyle wants to know, Lexi, as a fan of Fëanor, which of his sons is your favourite?
So I'll answer that briefly, and then I'll pile on the Nerdinel Love Fest real quick. Probably Maithros, favorite Tolkien character out of them all. Again, young little teenage Lexi reading through the Silmarillion and falling hard for the angsty antiheroes who've undergone great torment and struggle to make the right decisions, but they fail every time. And, you know, his mother name means well-formed, so, you know, you gotta imagine he wasn't unpleasing to the eye. So Maithros hard up there, but I have also developed a strong fondness that will appall many people for the character of Celegorm, who I view as being like almost a purely sociopathic character, and that he really, like, it's really unclear to him. He's a huntsman, he's a follower of the Valar Orome, so I think he's got this really primal view of things, sort of the strongest shall survive, and if you want something, you need to take it. Hold on. There we go. Sorry, phone alarm. Yeah, I think he's kind of a fun one to watch, because we see that, just that drive to do things, and just the utter lack of regard for the morality of those actions, and just kind of going by what he thinks makes sense in the moment to achieve his objective, which is very, very weird to see in an elf. We see that in men sometimes in Middle-earth, but really rare to see that in an elf. So I like Killigorm too. I wouldn't let him watch my children, but I would maybe get a heavily supervised beer with him someday.
He's so bad that his own dog abandons him as well.
I know, right? And like, poor and Huan is like the best character in the whole. He is the bestest boy. So circling back, Maitros, favorite Feanorian, very similar to Nerdanel, who is my favorite, I guess, like Feanorian in-law, because the other ones don't have names. Things that we kind of can scrape together about Nerdanel. She's a sculptor. I think it's Morgoth's ring that there's a slightly expanded version of, and again, this is later writings. This isn't necessarily what would have made it into some sort of hypothetical perfect final draft of the Silmarillion. But it is an interesting thing that builds off of what's present in the Silmarillion. She was a sculptor who created both sculptures, realistic, naturalistic sculptures of people that she knew, or sometimes of the Valar, that were so realistic that people walking by them would kind of do a double take and mistake them for those actual people, or would, if it was someone they knew, they would start talking to the person potentially. So very skilled, but also we know that she did some abstract stuff. She branched out into doing these forms, I forget how he describes it, of things that had not been seen by the elves or something. So she does just weird sort of shapes as well. And we know that she and Fëanor supposedly, again, according to this particular timeline, they get married fairly young. They kind of fall in love when they're out mountaineering together, so that's another fun dynamic to their relationship. They're geeks in love in the forge, and then they go out on extended camping trips, and I kind of suspect that it would make sense for both their characters if they kind of did old school Cuivianan elven marriage, where they kind of forewent all the ceremony and just kind of vanished into the wilds and came back and were like, well, we're married now. And as far as her father goes and what Fëanor learned from his apprenticeship there, number one, Fëanor's going there for apprenticeship. It's Fëanor who's the most talented in anything that he sets his mind to. He's made significant contributions to linguistics and to just writing and the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones, like gem work, metalcraft, all of that. Anything that involves making something, Fëanor excels at. So he goes to Matan, which is significant in its own way. You have to imagine that he must have been one of the best of the best. And in the Silmarillion, there's a line that when Fëanor starts this business of making swords and making it fashionable to carry swords around the streets, like, who are you going to kill, bro? It's paradise. Mahal greatly rues, or something, again, I'm paraphrasing, that he ever taught Fëanor to do that kind of thing. He's like, oh my gosh, I gave the guy the skill to make weapons, and now here he is making weapons. And so Mahan was not into it. Nerdanel, I think, goes back to live with her parents and family when she becomes estranged from Fëanor. And that's all kind of weird stuff that's in the appendices, and again, it's like maybe a total of 4 sentences that Tolkien probably crossed out at least 1 or 2 of them immediately after writing. But I think it all is relevant to and doesn't contradict at least what we know of her character in the more sort of canonical texts. So that's my hoard of Nerdanel lore that I have laid open.
Awesome, thanks for the answer. We're sort of roughly through the 2 hours that I'd planned here, so I'm just going to take a little bit of a break just to make a few announcements. Excuse me. I have the next episode of the Silmarillion Explained coming next week. It was supposed to be out last week, but I slipped on my editing, and also the announcement of Rings of Power the week before kind of created some extra work there. So the video is finished, but I've scheduled it for Wednesday now. So the next episode of Silmarillion Explained will be out on Wednesday, featuring the voices of Eoystin and Nicolene from the Fellowship of Fans podcast as Thingol and Melian, respectively. So that'll be the first half of chapter 17. Also, I will be on, she's in the chat right now, Geeks Derilia's channel. Hi, Cecilia. Geeks Derilia is predominantly a Spanish language channel. they cover sort of all sorts of different fandoms and different things. She's a big Lord of the Rings fan. I've been on panels with her before. She's a lovely person, so I'm looking forward to that. We'll be talking about primarily the Peter Jackson movies, but we'll also cover probably some talk about the Rings of Power as well, and adaptations that are coming up in the future, and just have a good chat. So that'll be 8 p.m. GMT on Saturday, which is 3 p.m. Eastern, if I'm not mistaken. So that's what's coming up for me. My next stream after this one will be in 2 weeks' time again, which happens to be Valentine's Day. So I don't have a topic for that yet, but presumably I'll probably cover something romance-related, potentially. But I think it might be difficult to get a guest for that one, so we'll have to see. Meanwhile, the teaser trailer for the Rings of Power is rumored to come out during the Super Bowl halftime show as well, which is the night before that. So potentially we could be talking about that in 2 weeks' time as well. But I'll keep people updated on that and let you know what to expect. Do you guys have anything that you'd like to plug? Anything you're working on your channels? I'm going to ask Robert first of all, since you were kind enough to have me on recently. What have you got coming up on Indie Geek, my friend?
Well, thank you. I have 2 channels. For those who don't know, my main channel is Indie Geek. I just before we went on air here just released a video with the title "Did Pippin Save Middle Earth?" So if that intrigues you, then not now, because you're enjoying this wonderful live stream here now, but when this finishes, if you wish to go and check that out, please do. And my second channel is called The Well Told Tale, which is me reading audiobooks. Basically, I love classic science fiction and fantasy stories, just the absolute classics of the genre, and I just narrate them. And we have started for this year the Picture of Dorian Gray. That's on the podcast. So if you're interested at all in the Picture of Dorian Gray, and if you're not, you should be, because it's an absolute classic. If you are on the YouTube channel, that's a few weeks behind, but I think you can get hold of The Vampire at the moment. I think that's the most recent one I put up there, which is, for those who do not know, this was, if you remember, the world's most famous short story competition with Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and people like that Frankenstein emerged from. One other story emerged from it, which was The Vampire by John Polidori, which is the start of modern vampire stories. This is where they're bringing together all of the ancient legends and setting up this new mythos. So if you're interested in that, go and check out The Well Told Tale.
Superb. And Lexi, what have you got coming up on Girl Next Gondor?
First of all, I just want to say that I saw, Robert, your recent video on how powerful is Shelob, and I watched it with great enjoyment. It tickled all of my arachnophobia, so people should check that one out if they either dislike spiders extremely, or if they, for some reason, I like Kelegorm, so someone out there probably enjoys Shelob.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. As for what I've got working on in the channel right now, I've been kind of had my hands full lately keeping up with the content. I've got a couple requests and series and fulfillments that I'm trying to work my way through. So I've been doing a series since about September on magic, where I've been getting really, really nitty-gritty and kind of undertaking this inherently hopeless quest to try and apply some consistency and some hard magic rules to Middle-earth and see where that gets us, kind of with an eye to imagining how things could work in adaptations. There's a few high-profile adaptations of Tolkien coming out in the near future. I don't know if either of you are at all aware of those. There hasn't been any hype or anything lately. So the next one in that series is, I've now gotten to the point where I've talked myself into a box and I need to touch on magical artifacts, including, of course, the Rings of Power and the Silmarils, which is going to be a significant undertaking. I think there's a question coming up that is about the Silmarils and how paradoxical they seem, and I have a lot of thoughts, but so far no answers. So that's should be coming out in the next few weeks. We'll see more the magic of the Silmarils, the magic of the rings in particular, and then just how you can imbue objects with magic generally. That's kind of my big research project at the moment. Probably something on Andreth and Agnor around Valentine's Day, and then working right now on a timeline video, which I know has never been done before. That's a joke. There have been many lovely installments that give a timeline overview of Middle-earth, but I'm trying to bring it under 30 minutes to summarize all of the necessary context for a new reader, and that has been just a delicious challenge in its own way, and not painful or again, kind of inherently hopeless from the get-go at all.
Can I quickly jump in and hand the compliment back to Lexi, as she said a nice thing about one of my videos. If you are watching this and you have never actually checked out Girl Next Gondor, you definitely should. The video series on things like the nature of magic in different ways, absolutely top drawer. Lexi is a very, very knowledgeable person and also an exceptional communicator. So I would just wish to pay back the compliment and encourage people to go and check her out.
Yeah, massively co-sign that. She's one of my favorites in Tolkien YouTube. Very original thinking, very good communicator, and wonderful editing as well, actually. The editing's come on leaps and bounds since you started, and it's one of the top channels, so definitely do check the channel out.
You guys are very kind.
But yeah, now that we've all said lovely things about each other and whatnot, let's get back to Feyenoor.
You're okay too, Dan.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm going to go back to the next Patreon question. So let me just scroll down in my document here. Yeah, so this is about the Silmarils. The next several questions are all about Feanor's various crafts and different things that he created and artifacts and so on. And so the next two, on a related note, are about the Silmarils. This is from Cloaked One, who says, "We know that the Silmarils are different in making to the One Ring, but do they hold some of Feanor's spirit, fire, passion, and pride within them? Can the jewels corrupt those who hold and keep them? We know Beren, when he successfully took one Silmaril, was tempted to take the remaining two. Thingol requests a Silmaril as payment for Lúthien's hand. The dwarfs slew Thingol after he withheld the Nauglamir, what they saw as their rightful payment. So even those with what we can view as noble hearts and minds, e.g. Beren or Thingol, may be influenced in a negative way when near the jewels." So this is a really good question. I really like this one. And it's definitely an interesting thing to think about with the Silmarils, because they kind of have some unknown properties, but primarily, and we're going to get to this in a minute, they are works of art first and foremost. On the specifics of this question, I would say it's important to remember that Beren resisted the temptation to take the other two, and that he left without trying to take more than his quest actually demanded, and that his intentions were pure. He was trying to win the heart of the love of his life, and he was trying to fulfill his oath to her father. And so his intentions were pure there, and that was why he was able to handle the Silmaril in the first place. As for Thingol, I wouldn't necessarily say that he was as pure as the driven snow. Thingol is another interesting conflicted character. He comes around later on to accept Beren, but initially he's very opposed to the whole interspecies marriage thing, which is a little bit hypocritical considering his wife is not an elf. It's intriguing to me that he desired the Silmarils without ever having seen them either, because he learnt about them from his wife, who learnt about them from Galadriel. And it's kind of similar to Saruman desiring the One Ring without ever having beheld it with his own eyes as well. I would say that the Silmarils have different properties to the rings. I don't think that they have the same corrupting influence on one's psyche that the One Ring has. I don't think that's what's going on there. I think, in my impression, is that the Silmarils don't actively corrupt the will of those who desire them, but they are just objects of great desire due to their immense beauty, and we should take that at face value, basically. Thingol's desire for the Silmarils was what caused his realm to become ensnared in the doom of Mandos. And so I don't think that we should view him as a particularly pure example, at least not in this context. Thingol does other things as well that, you can laud him for and you can appreciate about him, but I don't think that he's necessarily a good example of somebody who has a noble heart, as the question says. We have a related question, which I'm going to get to in a second, but I just want to get the panel's thoughts on what we've heard so far from Cloaked One's question.
I'll go first on this one. So I think Tolkien deliberately doesn't go into the detail about the mechanisms of how the Silmarils are created, and he sort of says, we'll have to wait for the end of time, and maybe then Fëanor will be able to tell us then. So it's kept deliberately a bit vague. But the very base, there definitely is this: they are the most beautiful and amazing things you've ever seen, which is there, and so the capturing the light of the two trees, the two trees, is that, and that is then the only bit of pure and holy light then left in the world. This is astonishing. So at the very base, they are, yes, hugely amazing, and of course people want them, but there's also something more there. With the connection with the ring, the One Ring, we hear Sauron basically, he poured himself into the One Ring. All his anger and malice and bits of who he was as a person went into the One Ring, which was very kind of Horcruxy for the Harry Potter generation. This isn't that, but the way that Fëanor talks about them when he's asked to hand them over makes it very clear that this isn't just this is a nice thing I've made. There's a connection between him and his creation, and he even goes as far as saying, if these get destroyed, I die. There's a connection between the two of them. So I don't think it's too fanciful to say that part of who he was did go into, given that this is clearly a way of forging Sauron. The way that Sauron worked was a way of forging that all came up from being learned from the same Aula at the end of the day. So I don't think it's fanciful to say that part of Fëanor's soul in some way did inhabit the Silmarils, but it made them this kind of weird combination of being hugely holy and yet also having this hint of corruption around them at the same time, which is I think what makes them so fascinating. They're not just an evil thing, they're not just a holy thing, they're a little bit of both.
I don't personally believe that they are evil at all. I don't know whether it is a Horcrux thing going on with them, but I don't know. I can't really necessarily prove that, but I don't think there's enough evidence to say that is what. This is
headcanon for me rather than anything that Tolkien wrote. This is so just to clarify. So I think the Horcrux thing is Sauron with the One Ring, sort of. But I think that it's not out of bounds to suggest that the kind of abilities that Sauron had, we know he learned them from Aula at the beginning, and that all came down obviously through to Fëanor as well, through a slightly different route, which I think maybe we'll talk about in a moment. But they would have learnt the same kind of smithing ideas, and so if you pour some of yourself into creation of this masterpiece is a way that magic works in Tolkien's world, then I don't think it's fanciful to say that maybe there was a little bit of him in there, particularly given the fact that he seemed to imply, if you destroy them, you kill me.
I'm not convinced that he was on the level, though. I mean, he also... Go on, Lexi.
Yeah, in support of that, I will say that Aule kind of backs him up in the moment, says... Give him some time to think. This is not a trivial thing that you are asking, whereas everyone else is screaming, just give Yavanna back the jewels, give us back the trees, and we can all kind of move on from this. And Aule's like, no, like, these are serious things. The decision to destroy them is going to be, regardless of whether it actually kills them, which I think we can debate. Aule agrees that this is going to be a significant act for Fëanor. And we also have totally different context, but this little story in Unfinished Tales that I keep coming back to about the Druadan, those weird sort of not quite hobbits, not quite normal men, Gonborigan type people.
The Woses.
And the Woses, and one of them creates this sentinel stone, which is sort of a squatty little statue of him, and the legend goes, and again, this is Tolkien in a very legendary mode, this is a folktale, so perhaps not to be taken as history, but the legend goes that the statue actually stamps out a fire, and the next day, the guy who made it, his legs are burned, and he gives the little proverb, if something of your power goes into something that you have made, then you yourself will share in the hurts of that thing. So there is, I think, thematically, certainly no proof. So you're right, you can argue whether or not would they have killed Fëanor? Is this just his pride and his greed talking, because he definitely has both of those in spades. But it's certainly in keeping with the idea that if Fëanor could have put something of himself into the Silmarils, which I think he probably put something of himself, if only his creativity and his eye for beauty and so forth. And furthermore, that damaging that would damage him, so that there does imply at least the potential, the possibility for a connection between Fëanor's soul and these gems that he has made on a more spiritual or supernatural plane, a more literal plane than obviously the symbolic connection that exists. But again, there's no proof of that. It's just it would fit.
Yeah, I won't labour the point, but I will read out the section just so that people can hear the point, if that's okay. So Yavanna and others have sort of said, yes, can you hand over the Silmarils? And then Aula the Maker said, be not hasty, we ask a greater thing than thou knowest. Let him have peace yet a while. But Fëanor spoke then and cried bitterly, for the less even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain, first of all the Eldar in Aman. And I think, interestingly enough, Mandos then says not the first.
Because his dad is already dead at this point.
His dad is, but he
we
doesn't
know that
say...
the last part of that is not true.
Well, yes, but he is... So Fëanor doesn't know that, but no. Mandos does not debate the point that he would die. He says you would die, effectively, you would die, but you wouldn't be the first to die. So, as I say, I won't labour the point, but I think that it's sort of headcanon for me.
Yeah. No, that's well justified. I think you can see it both ways. I'm not convinced that he would have really died. I think that he's saying that because he wants to make a rhetorical point here and he wants to keep his precious jewels. But that might just be my impression of him as a character. And I could be wrong, because he's not really somebody for lying. He's somebody for manipulating with the truth more than he is a liar. He's not really a deceiver in that way. And he's somebody who hates lies when they come from his enemies. Yeah, you could definitely see it both ways. But we've got another question on the Silmarils. I'm also going to read this one out as well from Matthew. He says, the Silmarils seem to be assigned to fire, water, and air as they are destroyed. Is there any evidence that they might have had different powers, properties, or were they the copies of each other? There's no evidence that they have different powers or properties, I don't think. And the fire, water, and air is their fate. It's where they end up. Which is gloriously paralleled in the 3 Elven rings as well, which are also the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Water, and Ring of Air, as I've said several times before in the past. But yeah, there's no real evidence that they do have that there's any difference between the 3 different jewels. They all seem to be the same kind of mechanism. I don't know that they have more power when they're all together in one place either. We can't say. Tolkien doesn't tell us. So that's my very quick answer to that. But we have another question from Patreon, which is on a similar note. So I'm going to launch straight into that one. So this is a related question from Stephen Stark, who's in the chat. He's just come back. And he says, the Silmarils are obviously extremely powerful, both literally and symbolically. They are made to capture beauty. But what exactly do they do? Do they have some kind of effect on elvenkind? Are the Silmarils perhaps a work of art and nothing more? Do they represent something deeper than that? Either in the context of the story or to Tolkien himself, why are they so important that the Silmarillion is named after them? So yeah, excellent question. I really like this. So the Silmarillion wasn't always called the Silmarillion. At one point, it was called the Quenta Noldorinwa in the 30s, which is history of the Noldor. Before that, of course, it was the Book of Lost Tales. So the Silmarils took on more importance. They took on titular importance later in the development of the Legendarium. So that's the first thing to say about that. Why did they take on that importance, and why are they important thematically? I think it's because of the light. They contain the light of the trees, and that's the really, really important thing about the Silmarils. It could be the light itself, which is most precious, I think. Melkor is said to have started with a lust for light, the Valar Quenta states. It says, he began with the desire of light, but when he could not possess it for himself alone, he descended through fire and wrath into a great burning down into darkness. And darkness he used most in his evil works upon Arda, and filled it with fear for all living things. So that beginning with the desire of light, we can take that very literally, because we're also told elsewhere that he desired Varda, effectively his brother's wife. So there was jealousy going on there, and it was the desire for light that first attracted Melkor to the Silmarils. So I think that's a really, really important point. How is that important to Tolkien thematically? I would point to, there's a poem which is addressed to C.S. Lewis that Tolkien wrote shortly after C.S. Lewis reconverted to Christianity, where he talks about splintered light and how it's a creator's kind of muse, and he sort of uses the metaphor of light within that context. And he's talking about kind of refraction of light and how light is split, which there's a line that Gandalf says to Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, when Saruman reveals himself as Saruman of many colors with the shimmering multicolored robe that he wears. And Gandalf says, somebody who breaks a thing has left the path of wisdom, effectively. I'm paraphrasing, but so on a symbolic level, light is really, really, really important. And I think that's one of the key things to think about with the Silmarils. But yeah, I've talked for quite a bit here, so I'm going to throw this again to the panel. And you guys can chime in as you want, as usual.
So Silmaril thoughts then.
Mm-hmm.
On what exactly they are, and the fact that they do seem to be very powerful and very coveted. And this is kind of also bouncing off of the previous question. What is it exactly that they are? What are they doing? What are they doing in the story? What are they doing kind of metatextually? Like, what role are they playing in the story? So, as far as the light goes, the fact that the Silmarils contain the light of the trees, and how the light of the trees is the light of the innocence of the elves, effectively the only way, with the loss of the trees and their light, and it's preserved only in the Silmarils, and then what comes out of that to illuminate the world later is the sun and the moon, but we're told that these are poisoned versions of that light. They've been affected by the taint of Ungoliant, who somehow has the capacity to convert light into unlight, which is very weird for Tolkien. Historically, he has this famous, oft misquoted, oft abused line that evil cannot create, it can only destroy. This in keeping with his orthodoxy, generally speaking, the kind of Neoplatonic, I'm not a philosophy doctor by any means, but the idea that there is only good and evil, insofar as it exists, is a perversion of what originally was good. So light very much tied into that as being, we hear most of the time the evil deeds of Sauron and of Morgoth are referred to as a shadow, as in something that stands between or blocks or prevents the light of goodness from coming through. But Ungoliant is an interesting example. When she destroys the trees, she drinks the light and turns it into something that's worse than darkness, which seems to be some sort of actual physical manifestation of evil, which is a really weird, again, kind of an anomaly. So we have the poisoned light of the sun and the moon. We have now the light of the trees turned into something, and presumably Ungoliant continues to have the power to belch forth this active physical darkness, the unlight. And then we have the Silmarils, which are the last for the elves especially, and for the Valar as well, who seem pretty eager to get them, to use them, and then even after the trees have died, presumably without any hope of reviving, it's still, when Eärendil brings them the Silmaril, that is when they start to reconsider. That is sort of the, again, I don't want to ascribe human motivations to the Valar. I presume that they know what they're doing in general, but it is the offering back of the Silmaril that kind of triggers them to finally go in and clear Morgoth out. It's obviously the Silmaril one of them ends up on Eärendil's brow, and he sails through the sky and fights dragons with it. So it's the question, too, of the Silmarils existing as, yes, they are light, but they are also crystal. They have a hallowing upon them from Varda, so that's a third element in sort of what they do. And fourthly, they are the subject of multiple oaths and curses and vows and intentions, which we know have potential supernatural effects in Middle-earth. So they're at the center, of course, of the Oath of Fëanor, which is a whole mess. It extends out more broadly to involve all of the Noldor and the Curse of the Noldor. We have Baron's various oaths on the matter. We have Morgoth presumably throwing his 2 cents into the whole wreck. So a lot of what happens around the Silmarils is not necessarily due to the Silmarils themselves, as it is due to all of the thoughts and intentions of all of the people who see them about things like light and beauty and redemption and purity. So that's one kind of angle that I'm working, I guess, on the Silmaril problem, because it is a problem. It's very strange in contrast to Lord of the Rings, where the MacGuffin is a ring, and it's a beautiful stand-in, and the whole work stems from the idea that the ring gives you power, and the whole thing is a meditation on power. Well, if the Silmarils are beauty, then it's weird to think of the Silmarillion as a meditation on beauty, because so much of it becomes kind of ugly. But then on the other hand, you have the idea that evil good to have been, the idea that the story is better than it would have been had not the beauty triggered the jealousy and triggered the pride and then triggered the whole arc of the Silmarillion that Manwë at least seems to view as worth having existed. And then finally, and this is a pretty minor note, so in the Silmarillion, it's weird, it's ambivalent, it's kind of like the Curse of Turin. It's like, is this real or is this just a product of people's, I guess, the power of suggestion? But the Silmarils do seem to have some sort of protective effect. When Carcharoth has one in his belly, it drives him mad, but it also gives him the power to break through the girdle of Melian. When Luthien is wearing one around her neck, it says that the land that she inhabits becomes rich and fair and protected and full of life and fertility, and that the sons of Fëanor, even though they're bound by their oath, they fear to assault it because she's just combination of Luthien plus Silmaril is just too much for them to contemplate violating. And then Elwing, her people seem to think that she does a similar thing with the Silmaril she inherits, that she's able to protect Sirion through the Silmaril somehow, and so they are very reluctant to concede to letting it go for any reason. So all of that on Silmarils and how they work and what they do and why they matter and why they're glowy.
Also, Eärendil as well. Think about him. I mean, he takes the Silmaril to Valinor at the end of the Silmarillion, and that's similar as well. I mean, we're not told because that chapter is so terse in its kind of treatment of the storyline, but I get the impression that was the reason or the explanation for how he was able to reach Valinor and get through the shadowy seas and the enchanted isles there and reach Aman, and why Varonwë, for instance, failed. We're not told that. We can only infer it, but based on what we see of the Silmarils elsewhere, I do get the impression that they have a power to pierce veils of kind of magical, enchanted areas that are protected by shadows and bewilderment, which is the phrase that the Silmarillion uses a couple of times. That phrase, I pointed this out in my Silmarillion series, is used for the hiding of Valinor, the shadowy seas there in the west, and it's also used for the girdle of Melian, which, as you pointed out, Lexi, the Silmaril seems to have a power to pierce that. So on a very high level, Elendil is able to reach Valinor because it's his destiny, but I think on a practical level, he's able to do so because of the Silmaril. But yeah, Robert, did you have anything to add on what we've talked about there on the powers of the Silmarils?
Well, not so much the powers. I think I would agree with you there. I think in terms of what they're there for, what is their purpose, their kind of literary purpose. I'll go the next layer up of meta, if that's okay. There's a fantastic interview, if you've ever seen it, with you can actually, there's videos I think on YouTube where Tolkien was asked whether Middle Earth was the world we live in but at a different era, and then he said no, at a different stage of imagination. And I think I would say, if you try and keep that in the sort of the context of what he's doing here, the sort of the conceit is that after in moving towards the fourth age onwards, it becomes the dominion of man. It becomes more like the world that we know, and this is the mythology that's back there in the olden days. And at the meta level, therefore, what we have is this movement from the very first few chapters are all very, and here's the creation of the world, and this is a very high level, and this is God speaking. And then each bit, as you move through the Silmarillion, you get less and less of that, and it becomes more and more like the world that we might understand. And part of this is the world itself being shaped. Part of this, and this is picking up what you were saying, Lexi, about the purity and the beauty that is sort of represented by the Undying Lands, by Aman, and then you have the holy light of the two trees, and then that goes away, but we've still got a little bit of it left in these actual gems which people are sort of wandering around with, and then they go away, but there's a star up there which has still got that. And it's like it's slowly over the whole period of history where the purity, the ardor unmarred, is slowly pulling back, as it were, leaving us with what we have. And so at the very end, and you can, it's probably worth a video at some point, because the kind of the links when you go all the way through with the symbolism of the Silmarils, and then the star, and then the File of Galadriel, and then that's used to be taking down Shelob, and Shelob is obviously the daughter of Ungoliant, and this is the whole linking all the way through that. This is Tolkien using these three gems as a mechanism for showing the dimming of the purity of Aman and the Undying Lands in Middle Earth. That's not to say that there isn't any beauty or purity, but it's just saying that unmarred beauty is now only found in smaller places. And so, yeah, that's my sort of the high level of what's happening, is that you just see the diminishing. You have the trees, then you have the Silmarils, then you have a star, then you just have a little file of the light from the star, and it's just like each time you're moving down a little notch to being, and even eventually that itself dims and dies. So it's we're just left with literally looking at a star.
Yeah, so it's a gradual diminishment of the world. That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, it's also in the elves. Like, if you look at the peoples of Middle Earth as well, they also become lesser over time. The world itself overall is diminishing. It's not just light is like a symbol for that, but it's everything, you know. And magic is leaving the world. The elves are sailing into the west, and it's kind of pessimistic almost in a way. But
also optimistic, because it's allowing we're moving slowly away from the Silmarils, but this is away from a world where everything's being managed by these angelic beings to actually a world where humans can stand on their own 2 feet and manage their own affairs. So taken from that perspective, the Silmarillion is written from the elf perspective. Of course, it will feel like a very sad dying of days. But if you think about it from the human perspective, this is actually the start of how humans got to inherit the world.
Tolkien, as a medievalist, would say that the humanity has also diminished in many ways. I think he would almost certainly argue that. I would think.
Yes, we are diminished, but the authority given unto us is increased because we don't have the direct oversight. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And in the end, if Dagor Dagorath is true, then we're headed for a reordering where the world will be remade and it will be perfect and the light will be undiminished. And so that's where the hope is in all of that. It's a very Norse kind of idea, I think. But yeah, I'm going to move on to the next question from Patreon now. Unless anybody else has anything more to say. Maybe I should give Lexi the last word on this if there's anything else to add. But
I'm just going to say off your point, if Finrod's right about the Dagor Dagorath, men being in charge and elves being the supportive role is actually the ultimate destiny of both of those races. The elves being the advisors to men. And actually, if you look at instances of elven and human friendship, I was doing some stuff on Turin earlier this week, and I got a bunch of comments that kind of triggered this realization for me. When elves and men become friends, typically what happens is that the elf just kind of sits back and yells things like, "You probably don't want to do that," but kind of goes along for the ride, and the man is the one... by man I mean human, is the one making the choices and changing the fates, whether that be for good or for ill in the case of Turin. And then you have Beleg, who's just kind of or Gwyndor just kind of swept along for the ride, but you get the sense that that is the dynamic that they kind of slot into. Voronwë and Tuor are examples of this. Legolas develops a huge man crush on Aragorn. It's beautiful. So I mean, from the theological perspective, yes, this passing away may be necessary for what's best overall, actually, for men and for elves.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. So we've got several more questions about Feanor's other creations, and this one is an interesting one because it touches on language, which is obviously really important to Tolkien. So we'll probably spend a little bit of time on this too. Could you cover some of Feanor's creations other than the Silmarils? I'm interested particularly in his contributions to language and the creation of the Fëanorian lamps. This is from Cloaked One again. So the Fëanorian lamps might be new lore for some people because they're not mentioned in the published Silmarillion anywhere, which I think is a shame because it gives us another example of Fëanor's inventiveness and his capacity for innovation. But they are mentioned in the Lay of the Children of Húrin, which is it's an alliterative verse poem that he wrote. Basically the Turin Turambar story in a poem. Alliterative verse being a common kind of medieval or Middle English poetic form, which Beowulf is alliterative verse. The Poetic Edda, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. All of these are examples of things that Tolkien was inspired by. So he was quite the poet, and he went through definitely a phase where he was writing these epic poems and he was writing these Silmarillion storylines in this form. And so I have a section from Unfinished Tales which addresses the lamps. So they're also mentioned in Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin, which is the unfinished story of the start of the Fall of Gondolin storyline, which is, it gets to the part where he just arrives at Gondolin and then it just stops, sadly. But they're mentioned when Tuor meets a couple of Noldorin elves before he meets Ulmo. Just as he's coming to the shore, he's trying to find the shore, but he can't find it, and he encounters a couple of elves who show him the way. So the quote goes like this: Gelmir brought forth one of those lamps for which the Noldor were renowned, for they were made of old in Valinor, and neither wind nor water could quench them. And when they were unhooded, they sent forth a clear blue light from a flame imprisoned in white crystal. So that's where they're mentioned here. There's a footnote, and Christopher describes them in the footnote. So this is note 2 of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin. So Christopher tells us, the blue shining lamps of the Noldorin elves are referred to elsewhere, though they do not appear in the published text of the Silmarillion. In earlier versions of the Tale of Turin, Gwyndor, the elf of Nargothrond, who escaped from Angband and was found by Beleg in the forest of Taur nu Fuin, possessed one of these lamps. It can be seen in my father's painting of that meeting. See Pictures by J.R.R. Tolkien, 1979, number 37. And it was the overturning and uncovering of Gwyndor's lamp, so that its light shone out, that showed Turin the face of Beleg, whom he had killed. In the published Silmarillion version of that story, it's a flash of lightning that shows Beleg's face instead. And so in a note on the story of Gwyndor, they are called Feyenoorian lamps, of which the Noldor themselves did not know the secret. So it was a technology that was lost to time after Fëanor died. He took the secret to the grave, sadly. Which is, again, it's that medievalist thing of things being better back in the day and things diminishing, I suppose. So the Noldor themselves did not know the secret, and they are there described as crystals hung in a fine chain net, the crystals being ever shining with an inner blue radiance. So yeah, that's more or less all we know about them. So that covers that one. As for the language, Feanor's main contribution to the language was his invention of the Tengwar, which is a Quenya word which means letters. And these are the script which we see most of the Elvish written in. The ring inscription is in Tengwar letters in the Lord of the Rings. And Tengwar can be used for other languages other than Elvish as well. It's used to represent English very often as well. You see lots of tattoos of different people with Tengwar on that isn't actual Elvish, because people have just literally transcribed the English word into Tengwar. So it's the script that Fëanor invented. And this was based on an earlier script, which I'm forgetting the name of, and I didn't put it in my notes, sadly. But that was invented by Rumil, who was interestingly called Lambengolmo, which is the Elvish Quenya word for lawmaster. So that might make a good Tolkien YouTube channel name, maybe. So Fëanor built on the achievements of people that came before him with his invention of the Tengwar. But Tolkien being the linguist and the philologist and so on, obviously him assigning this honor to Fëanor does Fëanor, a great service. It really kind of underscores his importance and his greatness and his skill as a craftsperson in linguistics, as well as in practical crafts that are more famously heralded, I suppose. So any thoughts from the two of you on the invention of language, and anything more to say about the Noldorin Fëanorian lamps? Let's start with Lexi.
So as far as language goes, there's two things mentioned about Fëanor in addition to his amending of Rumil's. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're called the Sarati, the original letters.
That's right, yeah.
Fëanor, is one of those weird ones. And then Fëanor imposing order and logic upon them, of course. He's also said to be one of the elves who learned the most of the speech of the Valar, of Valarin, and that he wouldn't share this with anyone because he thought it was silly and he didn't like the Valar anyway, and their language was stupid. So even though it was extremely difficult to learn, he was the sort of sole living expert on it who took the secrets to his grave, because his disdain for the Valar was that severe. And also, I think it's noted, this is deep, I forget where, but in some sort of very linguistic writing, there's a note that Fëanor, before his death, upon arriving in Middle-earth, had started to make notes on the derivation of Sindarin and Quenya from their common ancestor. And you got to think, like, the guy boots hit the ground in Beleriand, and he is just full bore toward Morgoth. Like, he immediately initiates an assault. There's really not a lot of time for reflection, but in whatever downtime the guy had, he was making notes on, this new, like, tongue that our sundered kin speak, and let me learn it really quick and start to make notes on its linguistic evolution. It's like, come on, man. Typical Fëanor.
I think the only thing I would add on the language thing is I find it quite notable that Tolkien clearly was a philologist himself, and when he's describing the greatest of the Noldor, the greatest of the children of Ilúvatar, of course, this person dabbles in language creation. This is exactly what would a great person do. That's exactly what they do, spending their time. I do have another quick headcanon thing here about Fëanor's inventions, because if you think about, like, when the rings were created, we know that they did quite a few trial runs first before creating the rings of power. There were lots of minor rings that they created. This is what Gandalf assumed the one ring was that Bilbo had. He just thought this was one of those sort of minor trinkets that was there with ring technology, which does make me wonder whether Fëanor was sort of like the same, is that he was building up to a big thing, and in order to get there he started out with a smaller thing just to practice out a few things. So the Fëanorian lamps, they strike me as being like the starting point for this technology of what might turn into the Silmarils, in terms of they have a glowing light inside them at all times that can't go out. That's one aspect of what the Silmarils are like. And so I think, okay, maybe that's there. There's also another invention that is very briefly mentioned, which I'll just read out what it says. That other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. So he basically invented the telescope. And this, if you think about the other thing that we know that he did, the Palantiri, what are they? They're ways of seeing things that are far away. When you read about how you actually use a Palantiri, it's not in the films, the movies, it almost seems like this is like a crystal ball and you can look at whatever you want. But Tolkien did go into quite a lot of detail about, no, you have to like stand in this direction and look in the right way, and then you can see something, what's going on. And it is like looking through a massive magical telescope that allows you to then communicate. So it strikes me that he seems to create a small something that was pretty impressive in and of itself, and then off the back of that he thought, right, now I've understood how to do that, I'm going to create my masterwork over here with that, but multiplied by X.
It's interesting that you went to telescopes with the crystals that can see things far away, because I always assumed that was a cryptic, slightly veiled reference to the Palantiri. I always assumed that that's what that was. The Palantiri are mentioned in the glossary to the Silmarillion as well. So that was where my assumption came from there. But yeah, maybe it was the invention of the telescope. Robert, you're on mute.
Oh yeah, so I was just saying that I made the opposite assumption to you. So I don't know. The truth may be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Any more to say about that? We have got a question coming up about the Palantiri, so maybe I should just move on from that. Okay, so we've got two more questions from Patreon. No, three more. One of them's quite short though. Okay, so this next one is about the Palantiri, and this is from Nettie, the Questing Beast, another friend of mine. And she says, concerning the works of Fëanor, would it be possible to have a deep dive into his other great work, the Palantiri? I think there's a lot to be said about their influence in both the Second and Third Age. We know more about how they were a corrupting influence on both Saruman and Denethor, due to Sauron gaining one. But what about the links between Númenor and Valinor? Could being able to see what they could not have influenced the later kings of Númenor, especially after Sauron's arrival? I assume that means in Númenor. Influenced the later kings of Númenor into greater jealousy. So, and then she finishes by saying, it supposedly takes a great and powerful will to use them. So this is an interesting question about the Palantiri in the Second Age, which I can't help myself. I have to, speculate. Could we see those in the TV show in the Second Age? One would think that they would feature as a kind of prequel moment, as we see the adaptation of the Numenor storyline there. So maybe Amazon Prime's writers will answer this question for us in the years to come. But as the question hints at, one of the Palantiri could be used to see Tol-Eressëa. So this was known later as the Elendil Stone, and it was installed in the Tower of Elostirion, which was the tallest of the 3 white towers which Frodo and Sam see on their journey in the final chapter of The Lord of the Rings. Not the stone itself, but they pass those towers. Those towers are on the Tower Hills between the Shire and the Blue Mountains, where the Grey Havens are. So one of those stones could be used to see the west. And so the question is about how that would have affected the psychology of the kings, having the ability to see that. But I would point out that they could see it with the naked eye as well. The big thing about Numenor is that from the summit of the Menel Tarma there in the center of the island, it's possible, if you have the eyesight to see, you can see Tol-Eressëa from the summit. So that's where the real temptation comes from. The question also mentions Saruman and Denethor. And so I think it's it's their hubris which led them to use the Palantiri. And I think they excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. So it's their hubris that led them to use the Palantiri, and it was a symptom of their hubris, that the act of using them. And Sauron was able to exploit this. So I don't really think that the Palantiri corrupt them, intrinsically. I think it's Sauron's manipulation, and he affects them both in different ways. It should also be stated that where you say it supposedly takes a great and powerful will to use them, Denethor did have a great and powerful will, and he did use the Palantir for good. Gondor benefited from his use of the Palantir for a long time. It led to a bad end in the end, but it says in The Lord of the Rings that Denethor, was able to keep the forces of Sauron at bay using his Palantir. Was it wise in the long run? Probably not, but it's not as black and white as all of that. So, yeah. But going back to Numenor, there's not any strong evidence to suggest that the Palantiri affected the jealous kind of aspect of Numenorian society that developed later on. I would argue that it's the mortality issue is the key to the Numenor storyline, and I think certainly Tolkien would point to that. So I don't know that it's jealousy of the land of Valinor itself, and it would be the land of Valinor, not Tol-Eressëa, that would influence them towards that point of view. But it's worth thinking about, and I do think that the Palantirs were probably really important to Numenorian culture, but we don't know too much about them in the Second Age, so we can only speculate. And this is where I'm going to bring the panel in and ask them to speculate, because it's really interesting to think about the Palantiri in the Second Age. We never hear about them in the First or Second Age, really, apart from that we know that Fëanor created them, and we know that they were given to the Numenorians as a gift. Was that ill-advised? What do we think about the Palantiri? Lexi?
So I've got two thoughts. One really quick, kind of based off of what you were talking about, the connection between the stones and Tol-Eressëa. One of my audience members has suggested to me that the fact that the Numenorians could use the Palantiri to see into Tol-Eressëa necessarily implies that some of the elves and we've lost our host. There he is.
Sorry, I'm still here. I just had to clear my throat quickly. Carry on.
All good. You vanished for a moment. Some of the elves and dwarves could see into Tol-Eressëa, and necessarily implies that some of the elves and dwarves and some of the elves and dwarves could see into Tol-Eressëa. There he is. Sorry, I'm still here. I just had to clear my throat quickly. Carry on. You vanished for a moment. So the implication, of course, is that the elves of Tol Eressëa, which one would presume be predominantly Sindar and repentant Noldor, so ones with a little bit higher than average investment in the affairs of men and doings in Middle-earth, would then be also able to monitor what was going on in Numenor and in potentially later on in Middle-earth when the Palantiri moved that way. So that was kind of an interesting thing that I hadn't considered, the idea that there might be these elven survivors, maybe with relationships that they had forged that they wanted to check up on so-and-so's descendants, or they were concerned about so-and-so and all kind of clamoring to use this Palantir to check up on people that they had known or the descendants of people that they had known. Would Finrod be at all interested in checking out how Numenor went? We know that Finrod is one of the few people we know for sure was resurrected relatively shortly after his death. So I just kind of thought that was an interesting dynamic to consider, especially, as you said, in light of the Second Age and the dynamics between the actual political dynamics between Numenor and the Undying Lands, the Blessed Realm, becoming potentially a narrative matter to be fleshed out with actual characters. The second thing about the Palantiri that I always think is really cute is that I say cute. It's pretty cute, actually. Gandalf, when he's describing them to Pippin, who, of course, Pippin is Mr. Curiosity, and of course, the Palantir to Pippin is like catnip. It's like the ring would be to Galadriel. It's like everything he's ever wanted. You can look, if you want to badly enough, and see what's going on anywhere you want, even back through history, back through time. So, of course, Pippin is the one who falls to the Palantiri, and Gandalf is discussing how he wishes that he could look back and see Fëanor at work. And I just think that that's, number one, adorable, because Gandalf potentially, as a Maya, might have been around when Fëanor was actually at work. Maybe he probably wasn't, personally there to witness it, but looking back now, knowing what he knows now, he'd be like, yeah, I really should have paid more attention to that. And secondly, of course, the issue that the Palantiri themselves are the products of the hand and mind of Fëanor at work. Using the Palantiri to watch Fëanor working on the Palantiri would create a nice little Hall of Mirrors effect. So those are my two Palantiri thoughts with regard to Fëanor, and also with regard to their potentially corruptive effects. Like you, I think the corruption mainly comes from, they can be used pretty freely throughout the Third Age, but once the Nazgul take the one that's in Minas Ithil, later Minas Morgul, then people stop using them because they recognize that now they've become a potential source of deceit and corruption, because Sauron controls at least one of them, and if he controls one of them, he can influence all of them.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, actually, I suppose you put up the from the chat, David Lind pointing out that the Palantiri weren't given to the kings, but were given to the faithful, effectively, in Numenor.
I think that's right, actually.
Yeah, I was struggling. I was trying to remember that there's a quote about this, but I think that in terms of the Second Age, I think this is quite important in understanding what their usage presumably was. We don't know the details. We haven't been told the details, but we can kind of join up the dots. Is that they must have come across with Fëanor. That's how they got to Middle Earth in the first place. So they were with the Noldorin elves somehow, and then.
Ungoliant didn't eat them.
Well, yes. So they kept hold of them. We don't know who, but someone like Gil-galad is probably a good guess. When we're coming into the Second Age as the High King, and then as Numenor was going into the shadow, was starting to get dark, the elves could no longer come to Numenor. They got cut off. They weren't allowed to visit anymore. You weren't even allowed to speak any Elvish languages. So I wish I could remember the quote, but it is something along the lines of, so they gave the elves gave these Palantiri to the faithful in order to provide them with some comfort. So the implication is that this is a means of communication between the faithful, Elendil and co, and the elves. So what we may see on the TV show is that this is how they're going to get past this problem that they would otherwise have, which is that apparently we're going to be looking at this massive world of Middle Earth and stories happening all over the place. But how do people know what's going on in different places? In the way is presumably through these Palantiri. People can talk to each other through these. So I think we will be seeing them as a magical medieval telephone as much as anything else. But Elendil then took them across to Middle Earth when he left Numenor. So the implication, I think, is that they stayed in the good guys' hands. And because Elendil and co did stay faithful, I think that tells us that they are not in and of themselves corrupting these Palantiri. It's only when they start getting into the hands of, if you're having a Palantir conversation with Sauron, you might get corrupted. Or if you're trying to look at what Sauron's doing, and Sauron can try and tap into it because some of the stones were linked up. That's the kind of thing. That's when they start getting corrupted. But in and of themselves, I don't think they were a corruptive influence.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. So tools rather than weapons, really. And yeah, Sauron managed to weaponize them, but that was Sauron doing that. And we shouldn't really draw any conclusions about their influence on Numenorian society in that way.
Other than the fact that Sauron is evil, but Lexi likes him anyway.
I like him because he's evil.
I don't think that's very reassuring.
We've got a couple of super chats here. Plixiplox, $2, thank you. Says, did anyone create anything after Fëanor?
Nothing worth mentioning.
No, nothing worth mentioning. Just the Numenorians built cities, and the elves built Rivendell, and Sauron built Mordor, and but nothing worth mentioning. Thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it. Reflective rambling again for $10. This is a question from Erin M. So thank you for picking that up. Reflective says, or Erin says, are the Palantiri corrupted forever now, or are they clean again after Sauron is destroyed? Also off topic, guest was wondering if anyone speaks French. If any of us speak French, I don't speak French. I don't know if any of you guys speak French.
Un peu.
Are the Palantiri corrupted forever? So the one that Denethor has is corrupted forever. It says that it takes a great strength of will to be able to see anything other than, I think, just flames and his hands, I think, as far as I recall. I'm not sure if that's right or not, because I'm struggling to remember. It's been a while since I've done a Lord of the Rings reread. So, but yeah, certainly that one was ruined for all time afterwards. And but I think the others are relatively unpolluted. I mean, there's only one other one that's accounted for, which is the one that Aragorn takes from Orthanc. What happens to that? I don't remember what happens to that. Does he keep it there at Minas Tirith, or does he get rid of it after that? Does it go west? I think maybe it goes west with the last ship.
Certainly, at least one of them does. I think the Seeing Stone in the White Tower goes west.
Does it? So that's the one that Denethor's death ruins, effectively. So I remember.
Was it okay? That bit I'm not. I can't recall. But yeah, they certainly took at least one Palantir with them at the end, and I think it was that one off in the far west.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alexi, did you have any thoughts or any clarifications on any of that? Because maybe you remember this better than we do.
Palantir lore is not my strong suit. I would. It's interesting to know that the manner of Denethor's death, holding the Palantir that he had used for so long, it suggests again a kind of sympathetic relationship there, where that one is kind of ruined by the fact that its last user dies in an inferno clutching it, presumably bending all of his very distraught will on that act. And so I guess it's not beyond the realm of comprehension. Again, the interesting thing with the Palantir is that they're portrayed as They are a technology, and technically Tolkien is neutral on the matter of technology per se, but we always get the sense that because they are so efficacious, they exacerbate any latent temptations people might have toward overreaching. So I believe that probably once Sauron vanishes into the breeze, they would be not as risky to use in the sense that you don't have that risk now of Sauron coming through them and wrenching your will to his purposes. But, we kind of get this vibe with Pippin, because I don't know if it's Sauron's will reaching through the Palantir or if it's something else. But he seems to sense at first glance, before he even knows what it is, that it is an object of importance and of power, and he's just drawn to that, like, unbelievably so. So I suspect that at least part of that is due to the fact that, again, with a Palantir you can satisfy your need for knowing things, and again, this is a theme that Tolkien takes up again and again. Knowledge is fine, learning is fine, that's all great. It's when you start to value that above other things, and you want to get the power to know things for your own purposes instead of just sort of purely for its own sake, or so that you can use that knowledge to help people. That's when it becomes corruptive. So just in the sense that they're very powerful objects, I would suspect that there are risks to using them even in a, quote, uncorrupt state without Sauron's influence.
I have just reminded myself of the fates of the Palantirs. So there were 7. There were 3 in the Northern Kingdom, of which one was the Master Stone, the stone that could see all the way to the Undying Lands.
That ends up at the bottom of the ocean, doesn't it? I remember that one.
Well, the 2 of them do end up in the bottom of the ocean. That one is the one that gets taken on the boat across to Valinor with the ring bearers at the very end. Then we have 4 effectively in the southern, 3 in the Southern Kingdom and 1, the Orthanc-stone, sort of in the middle-ish. One Sauron was using in Barad-dûr, assumed to have been destroyed when everything blew up. One was in Osgiliath, then there was fighting in Osgiliath, and at some point it fell into the river and got lost. And then the Denethor one, the one that's in Minas Tirith, that, you're right, that's the one so when he went on to the pyre himself, he was holding that. And that means that from now on, yes, people can just see the flames and hands and screaming and bad things, which leaves the only one left is actually the Orthanc-stone, which was kept by the kings of Gondor after that. But what that means is that because now they're all accounted for and there's only one left, they can't be used for communication in the same way they were before. So what Tolkien did at the end of all of this is he took it all apart and said, okay, now, yes, we've got this again. It's like the same that we've just got the remnant. We've got one, and yes, we can do good things with a Palantir, but you could do better things with more than one of them.
It's like the light being split again, isn't it? In a way, it's the same thing as the Silmarils, and then them becoming, you know, the sun and the moon being born from the trees, and then later we get the fight of Galadriel. It's the same theme again, isn't it? Seeing with that. We had another super chat here. I'm going to move on to that. From Elu Thickgol, which I enjoy that name. I'm now thinking about Thingol's as butt, so thank you for the imagery there. Who says, just want to say, great stream with great minds. Good way to chill on a Monday. Thank you for putting this together. You and your guests are awesome. I just can only echo that. My guests are awesome, and it's not for me to say whether I'm awesome, but I do appreciate the compliment. So thank you for that, and thank you for the super chat.
You are awesome.
Oh, good. It was good to know.
Just confirming it.
I try.
Awesome.
But yeah, thank you for the super chat. So we've got a couple more Patreon questions to get through, and then I'm going to let you find people go. So that was the Palantiri. The next question is about the doors of Durin. Gandalf observes the Star of Fëanor on the doors of Durin. We are never really told about Fëanor having a crest, but it appears as a star with 8 rays. Could you talk or speculate on its imagery and history? This is once again from Cloaked One, so thank you for that. Interesting question. There's a little bit of lore behind this, so we can elaborate on this. The doors feature this design, and you probably know this already, but they feature this design because they were devised by Celebrimbor, who it was Feanor's grandson. This was also the creator of the Rings of Power. And he created this door in collaboration with Narvi, who was a dwarf of Khazad-dûm, who we don't really know anything else about. But that was symbolic of the relationship that existed between those two peoples at that time. The elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm had quite a close partnership and collaborated at that time. Those doors were closed during the War of the Elves and Sauron, and so that was the turning point there between the history in the relationship between those two people there. And then, of course, the Noldor were kind of wiped out, and most of them ended up in Rivendell. But on the Elvish heraldic devices, there is actually quite a bit of information about these. Tolkien gave us kind of different rules for different emblems and things. I don't remember what it is, but I think it's the house of a male elf has a lozenge, and the house of a female elf, or the symbol or crest of a female elf, has a circle, I think it is. And there are all sorts of different kind of rules that he devised for it, and he came up with all these different things. I think a lot of them were created during the Book of Lost Tales, and then later on they were published in an official calendar. So that's where we got these from, and there was a little bit of information in that calendar on what those were. So that's where we get this whole thing from. I've included some of these in some of my Silmarillion videos. So if you look closely, you can see some of these. There also the houses of men had these as well, these heraldic devices. The interesting thing here is, though, the star on the doors of Durin, which is right in the middle between the two trees. I was going to try and get an image up of it for this question, but I didn't have time. So sorry, you'll have to picture it. But it's somewhere in the middle of your copy of the Fellowship of the Ring, if you want to see that. It's different to the one that was included on that calendar that was part of the whole group of different heraldic devices that Tolkien invented. The one on in the Silmarillion Book of Lost Tales tradition is slightly different. It's more like I think it's like a sun with 8 points that kind of swirl round in a kind of geometric design, excuse me. Whereas the star that's on the doors of Durin is, I don't believe it appears in canon anywhere else, although it appears all over the place in fan art and so on. But it's a much simpler design. It's just a clean 8-pointed star. And so they're slightly different, is what I'm getting at. So there's two different designs going on there. Maybe it was a retcon on Tolkien's part, and maybe they were both symbols of the House of Feyenoor that were, along the same lines with the same theme, and it was just two different designs in universe. So I'm not sure, but that's what that was, and that's what we know about it, really. Other elves of the same house had other emblems that were similar to the Book of Lost Tales one that I'm describing. Fingolfin's was also very similar, and they were both designed based on Finwë's designs. So there were several different designs that were all along the same lines there, and other elves had other designs that were different. So that's basically what we know about that. But do you guys have any additional thoughts or knowledge that you could contribute on the Star of Fëanor? Lexi, I think maybe you'd be the person to go to on this.
I did. So I want to say it's the version published maybe in the mid-70s. There was a boxed set of The Lord of the Rings that drew on a lot of Tolkien's artwork. He actually did quite a bit of artwork, not only scenes painted or sketched or color penciled or watercolored of events from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but also he was constantly drawing and sketching designs and borders and patterns and tile work and all that kind of thing. And it is kind of a very idiosyncratic style. And
sorry if I could just cut in there. I actually
Yeah.
have a print of a crossword. I think it's the Times crossword that he doodled all over, and there's
Yeah.
like a geometric design that he just like went completely nuts on, and just drew this really elaborate design, just doodled all over it, which a lot of us do, but it's very elaborate and interesting, and sort of shows a lot about his mind, just from his doodles. So I have a print of that I've been meaning to get framed and put up in my office somewhere. So perhaps you'll see that behind me next to my Jimmy Corsier back here. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted. So carry on.
No, that's a good point. I think Tolkien's visual imagination and his skills as an artist, he wasn't, obviously, I don't think he would consider himself a proficient artist. It was kind of a diversion for him, which I think we can excuse him that. But he did have a very particular style, and I think there's been a lot of scholarly interest in that recently. I'm not super familiar, unfortunately, yet with the work on that. And I did some digging around on the internet just a couple hours before the stream because, like I said, when I was young, someone gave me that sort of a vintage, more interesting set of the box set of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings in this little case that was from, again, I want to say mid-70s, maybe it was the first printing, and it had all of these heraldic devices plastered all over it. So I immediately set about sketching and doodling and painting them myself because, like, again, I was a very weird little child and I was very into elven heraldic devices. So based on my vague memories of that, coupled with some hasty Googling, the pertinent point that I stumbled across, and I'm going to attribute that, I think, to, believe the citation for this was Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull have recently come out with something on, again, talking about Tolkien on as a visual artist and what his artworks what insight those might give us into his imagination. And according to according to the internet summary of their work on his notes about his art, so that's multiple chains back from me as a source, the number of points that reach a border indicate rank. So Finwë's device, for example, has multiple of these swirly rays coming out from the center, reaching all of the points, because he's not just a king, but he's the king of the Noldor. He's sort of the Uber Noldo, if you will. He's kind of the source from which they all flow. And then, depending on the era, Fingolfin and Finarfin both have 8 points, reaching the edges as respective high kings of the Noldor and Amon and Beleriand, respectively. And then Fëanor's is this weird thing where his has 4 points that reach all the way to the edge, and then 4 points sort of in between those that reach kind of halfway, but you could see how they could very easily be extended to reach the edge. So 4 points would denote a prince, and then 8 would denote a king. Again, according to multiple levels of remove from Tolkien's original text on that assertion, so take it with a grain of salt. But it's kind of cute then that he becomes known for having the 8-pointed star of the kingship, when that, during his lifetime, would have been very much an aspirational kind of heraldry to hold.
Yeah, and he was king for about 5 minutes at the end.
King in his own mind for about 5 minutes.
Yeah. I just realized, actually, while you were talking, that on my keyring here, I have a keyring which is a geometric design, which is a Tolkien doodle. So that's an example that I can show you guys without having to, reach through my possessions and scramble around my room here. But yeah, Robert, did you have anything to add about the heraldic devices and the Star of Fëanor and so on? Kind of an esoteric topic that we've covered in.
It is, and I can't hope to rival your knowledge, both of you, on the heraldic devices. That was really interesting, Lexi, about the how far the points go. I think all I would do is add an observation, which is when and how this might have come about, because this is the House of Fëanor, and so originally this would have been the I was going to say sigil. That's getting me back in the Game of Thrones world. But the sort of the heraldic sign for the High Kings of Noldor. That's what Fëanor. So Fëanor's sign for him and his house would have been, I'm pretty sure, whatever it is for being a king. No doubt about this whatsoever. If that is all of your points pointing towards the end of it, because through all of his life, he was either the heir or the actual king. What I think is quite interesting is that, from what you were saying, Lexi, this is nearly a king, not quite a king, sort of a king, and that has the feel for me of what we have a little bit later, because we've got Maedhros hands over the kingship effectively and says, okay, so the House of Fëanor is no longer the king house, but all of the sons didn't necessarily always recognize the kingship of Fingolfin and that line afterwards, and so it does feel very much like this. We're not quite the kings, but because we've given that up, but we're quite kingly, and I think it does. The 8 does match well with the fact this is Fëanor and 7 sons. So this is the kind of adds up and works really well for me. Is that this is the symbol that would have been created after the death of Fëanor himself for just a short period of time.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. There was something I wanted to add on this actually that I was just thinking about while you were talking was. In the Silmarillion, it said that the first heraldry was created during the same period that the first weapons were created as well. I don't remember the line exactly, but there is mention somewhere in, I think, chapter 6 of the Silmarillion. So there's an implication there that the first heraldry could have been the influence of Melkor, who was on the loose there in Valinor and free to propagandize and to teach his dark teachings. So possibly we're meant to think that these heraldic devices were not too wise and that they were politically divisive, or that they were a symptom of political fracturing starting to happen in Elvish society in Valinor, which is an interesting thought. And it also ties in with my next question, which I'm going to launch right into. So this is again from Cloaked One, which is an excellent question, which unfortunately it's going to be a short answer, but it's a good question to be asking, and I do appreciate the question here. He says, Fëanor made the first armor and weapons in Valinor. For an elf who was involved in the first kinslaying, we don't hear much about his sword. Do the texts cover his weapon at all, and does it have a name? It was claimed by his sons and handed down in his family after death. Sorry, was it claimed by his sons and handed down in his family after death? So the answer is we don't know. He doesn't have a named sword of any type. It's described as long and deadly in the scene where he confronts his brother in the court of Finwë in Tirion. But other than that, we don't know that it has a name. It doesn't seem to have any lineage. It doesn't get passed down to anybody as far as we know. So we don't know is the answer, unless you guys know anything better.
No. But I say that this works really well for me, because if we have to place this in the context of what it was, they were forging the very first weapons just in those last few years before the rebellion and the revolt and heading back over to Middle-earth. And so at this point, it wasn't a storied blade that had done huge and amazing things. In fact, everyone's sword was just a sword. We hadn't reached that point in history where you had to distinguish, this is an amazing sword and that's not. It's just, I've got a sword. This is new technology. This is exciting.
It's not, a sword, such and such name, heraldry. It's the sword.
Exactly.
It's the only one. So
this is my sword. So that works really well. That for me, that you don't, and the early, the first generation, they don't have these, and then when you get after battle after battle after battle and generation after generation have swords, you start getting these storied named swords.
Yeah, when you think about the nomenclature in Tolkien, a lot of the names are just like the literal Elvish translation of what the thing is. So perhaps the first ever sword was just called sword. That would make sense. But Lexi, did you have anything to add?
I would further add that when Fëanor and his ilk are forging swords in Valinor, they're not actually having to use them, presumably for anything more than a very showy, non-deadly duel. So it's quite possible that those swords weren't actually very good for what they would later be used for, more actual battles against actual, like, serried foes. And I actually quite like the idea that perhaps the Sindar, for all that they didn't have the technology or the forging acumen of the Noldor, actually had, at least for the first generation, the more effective weapons, whether that was through trade or through what have you. So yeah, perhaps Fëanor's sword, it could have just burned up with him and been twisted and warped when his spirit violently departed his body, or perhaps it just kind of got quietly melted down because the boys realized that actually this is, really not worthy of our father's name and really not very good at all. Let's quietly get rid of it and use some of these fancy new swords that our dark elven brethren are lending us so that we may more effectively sacrifice ourselves for their peace of mind.
Do we know that any of his sons had any named swords? Because I can't think of any there either. Maybe I'm wrong, but
there's the knife. Curufin has a knife called Angrist that actually snaps when Baron's trying to cut the Silmaril,
right?
Or trying to cut the one he goes back. So, but yeah, I think that's. I would think that there would at least be fanon on that if there were even so much as an intimation. And I am not aware of any other named blades apart again from Angrist. It really does seem to be more of a Sindarin thing to name your sword.
Yeah, again, I agreed. Okay, I'm gonna move on quickly then. So this is I think the very last question that I'm going to cover tonight. And thank you guys for staying this long and putting up with all my questions here. But it's good to have a lot to talk about. So this is the final question from Ridiculous Ed Tollett. And he says, since the sieges of Angband lasted all the way up until the War of Wrath, what good did it actually do for Fëanor to kill the Teleri for their swan ships just to get to Beleriand a little faster? Did the quick response of the Noldor stifle the expanse of Morgoth? If Fëanor and his group hadn't gotten to Middle-earth as soon, would Morgoth have been able to win a sound victory? So this is a complicated question, but I have to. I'm sorry, but I have to start out by correcting you a little bit on at least the terminology. The framing of the question makes perfect sense, but the siege of Angband didn't last until the War of Wrath. It lasted until the Dagor Bragollach. And so I think what you mean, though, is you mean the battles of Beleriand, the wars, basically. But the siege of Angband has a specific meaning, which it refers to the period between the Dagor Agoreb and the Dagor Bragollach, which was where the Noldor houses were kind of loosely united in boxing Morgoth in the north, in Angband. And during that time, he did launch raiding parties through various means, and there was skirmishes, but it was a period of relative peace there in the First Age. And then that all changed when the mountains erupted and lava flowed out, and Glaurung came, and this is a fully grown Glaurung who basically set fire to the whole of Ardgallen, and afterwards it was known as Anfalglith. So that was the end of the siege of Angband, just as a teaching moment there. But as for the question, the swan ship, why did Fëanor feel the need to steal the swan ships? And did it make a difference to how things played out? And would Morgoth have won quickly if he hadn't done it? Which is an interesting question, because I think the answer is yes. I think he probably would have. The Silmarillion makes it quite clear that he is in the process, if not damn near insieging Doriath. He has insieged the havens where Círdan lives on the coast, and he has wiped out the Green Elves, and he seems to have basically backed the Sindar into a corner where they're within their own lands and trapped inside Doriath. So I would think at that point that if the Noldor hadn't shown up when they did, then it would have been a matter of time before they were able to breach the girdle of Melian. I don't think that she would have the power to hold back Morgoth forever. I think he would find a way through. We do see that Karkaroth, when he swallows the Silmaril, manages to breach the girdle. So I would think that Melkor would make short work of it eventually. So as to the question, I do think that Morgoth would have conquered all of Middle-earth if the Noldor hadn't returned. What happens at that point? It's an exercise in what-ifery, and all we could do is speculate. But the Fëanor stealing the ships it illustrates Fëanor's character, and it adds to his story in a meaningful way. And it's just the way the story plays out. And if Fëanor doesn't do that, he's not Fëanor, so that it happens the only way that it can. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's worthy of speculation. But I do think that Morgoth would have won. At least he would have conquered all of Beleriand at that point, and it would have taken an enormous intervention at that point from Valinor to have taken that land back. And of course, that's what does happen at the end of the First Age. But yeah, we can only speculate. But guys, this is the last question. So who wants to go first? Lexi's unmuted, so I'm going to assume that you have something to say about this.
Yes. So it's interesting. The heart of the question is, why is Fëanor so gosh darn fired up to get to Middle-earth as quickly as possible? And that actually, his need for speed and urgency doesn't really have much to do with concern for Morgoth and what he's doing. There's been very little news of Morgoth's operations. The fact that Sauron is still hanging out in Angband preparing things, but he hasn't done anything yet. And then they start moving, but really the elves of Valinor have very little way of knowing that. So it's not so much Morgoth at all. He's concerned. He's won all of the greater part of the Noldor over to his side, but he knows that most of them dislike him intensely. They've been temporarily persuaded by his arguments and by just the emotional fever of the moment, with Finwë dying and the trees being destroyed, and the Valar apparently prepared to kind of sit there and do nothing and be very ineffectual in appearance. So his motivations in needing to get everyone to Middle-earth very, very quickly are, he knows, being smart if not wise, that he only has so long that people will go along with him in kind of the heat of the moment, and he senses that that's waning. And even as they approach the coastline, he knows that it's waning, and his greatest fear this whole time, his paranoia, has been that Fingolfin's gonna scoop him and take the High Kingship. And people are even now starting to mutter about, Fingolfin seems to kind of be a little bit more sane at this point, have a better head on his shoulders, be a little bit less unstable. So his motivation in pushing the issue so hard with Olwe, that we have to take these boats, we have to go now, we can't stop, we can't negotiate, we don't have time for any of that. If you're not going to give them to us now, we'll just start killing you, is because he's panicked that he's going to lose control of the Noldor, and he believes that he needs to be, this is part of his whole complex, is, his father has died and he's the heir, but then his kingship is under threat and his Silmarils are gone, and it's all just coming together in a wonderful storm of psychological damage. So he grabs the boats, not for any tactical reason, but because of his own internal fears that he's going to be betrayed. And this is, of course, why he burns them when he reaches the shore instead of sending them back to bring more people over. Now, the other part is, as you said, I think the Noldor arriving when they do, the first wave arriving when they do, and chasing Morgoth's forces all the way back to the gates, almost to the gates of Angband, and Morgoth having not really, suspecting that they were going to follow him, that there was going to be some sort of retaliatory action, but even he is kind of taken aback by the fury with which they sweep in and sweep things back from Círdan at the Falas and relieve the pressure on Thingol, who's kind of, like you said, holed up in Doriath at this point, there's a very real concern that Morgoth would have just swept the board in that moment and won had not the Noldor kind of showed up unexpectedly early. And there's the irony about this is beautiful, is the doom of Mondos specifies that having shed the blood of their kin, they're going to pay for that in blood. Well, what literally happens next is that they take the boats that they killed the Teleri to get and use those to inadvertently come to the aid of and rescue the Sindar and the Falathrim, who are the close kin of the Teleri. So, and you know, with great personal cost and Fëanor dying in the assault. So there's this curse or doom or what prophecy, some combination of the three, that Mondos or his emissary delivers could be read as like, oh, because you've killed your kin, now this curse is going to take revenge on you and kill you in turn. But actually what happens is much more elegant than that. Fëanor's own actions turn out to benefit some of the relations of the very people he killed. So, and you know, costing him his life in the process. So it's a very neat little, I think Mondos just saw that coming down the pipe and said, oh, I think I'm going to point this out to them now, and then they'll all be thinking that I'm much cleverer than I am, but actually they've all just done this to themselves.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't wish to add too much to that. I thought that was an excellent explanation from both of you. I think the only things I would say is, yes, for Fëanor, this was just all about Fëanor. He wasn't thinking about rescuing anyone. He was just doing what he wanted to do. And he made, if he'd been like anyone other than hot-headed Fëanor, he probably would have done a few things differently. He would have made sure that he had his full army there. I mean, even at the very end, when Fëanor himself dies, it appears that he's managed to get himself, he's charged on ahead and left his sons with the bulk of his forces a bit behind him. It's like, you're running, you're charging at a castle by yourself, is the kind of the feeling that we get. There were a few other people there, but it was like he left even the bulk of the smaller army that he brought with him. And it's like, it's almost that he wasn't thinking about anything. He's just focused. I'm just going there. I'm going to take this guy. I'm going to get back my Silmarils. That's it. That's the only thing I'm thinking about. So this was just all about him. Can
you imagine what Treebeard would have made of him? Don't be hasty, you know.
Well, quite, but I mean, he would have just started saying a sentence by the time Fëanor had died. But I think this all, as what Lexi was saying as well, is and what you were saying about that actually this had a good result. This comes back to what I was saying right at the top of this stream, is that with Fëanor. And the discord that was happening there, the bad and the ill. Yes, there were terrible things that happened there, but it brought about good things as well. So that is the meta narrative, and this is a thing that Tolkien comes back to again and again and again, bringing that good things will flow out even from evil actions.
One last thing on this as well. Fëanor really has two options here as well. He can either sail or he can cross the Helcaraxe. Which would you rather do? You know, I'd rather sail. I don't want to go up there in the north and have half of my army die from grinding ice and risk that path that no one's ever. People thought it was impassable until Fingolfin's host manages to cross, and even so, lots of people died. In the crossing of the Helcaraxe. So he really has to sail. The thing is, if he was anyone other than Fëanor, he might have tried to negotiate. He might have tried to find a compromise with Always people. But he's Fëanor, and he believes that he has the right to those ships because he's Fëanor. So that's why he does it. Maybe it turned out for the best that he did so, but yeah, that's the story as it was told. So yeah, I think that answers the question. But yeah, great question. So thanks for that. So that is the very last Patreon question. It's getting rather late, so I don't think we'll take too many questions from the chat. I think There was one super chat which I didn't mention, which was from Harry, just saying, "You three are expletive awesome." So thank you, Harry. You are expletive awesome yourself. And that's all for tonight, I think. Thank you both of you for staying so long. This has gone a little longer than I planned, but we had to get through all those questions, and I do appreciate you both sticking around. One last time, quickly, do you guys want to shout out for your channels and what you're working on and where people can find you? Let's start with Lexi this time, because I think I started with Robert in the mid-roll. So.
Yeah, if you want to hear more about me talking about Fëanor and how he never did anything wrong ever, and he is the true High King of the Noldor, and none else can hold claim to the title, I am on YouTube at Girl Next Gondor, all one word. Just type it in and see what comes up. I've got videos coming out roughly once a week. My next one's going to be an attempt to summarize all 3 ages plus a little extra. I'm also on Twitter, so hit me up there. Sometimes I show up on Fellowship of Fans to yell about how the Amazon series is not going to be canonical, which, I mean, I think at this point should not surprise anyone, but I'm going to keep saying it until it registers. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a blast. Hi to Howie. He's a pretty regular commenter over on my side of the internet, so want to recognize his contributions here.
Yeah, it's been a long time for you, of mine as well. Robert, where can people go to find you if they don't know about you? Where have they been? Have they been under a rock?
Just better things to do, I would have thought. Well, first of all, can I say thank you very much, Dan, for having me on. It's absolute pleasure and honor.
Pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
You guys have been amazing, as I knew you would be, which was why I was very happy to accept it. If you don't know, my main channel is called In Deep Geek. If you have always been wondering how Pippin saved Middle Earth, now your time has come. The video is probably about 3 hours old or something now, so please do go and check that out. And my second channel, if you like classic science fiction and fantasy, is called The Well Told Tale. Yeah, do go and check that one out as well. Also available as a podcast if you're a podcast person.
Excellent. All right, thank you both so much for coming on and for staying this long and for putting up with all this. And thank you for everybody for turning out and showing in the chat as well. I really appreciate all the comments, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to some more of them, really. But thank you for those who contributed, and thank you for those who were chatting and for watching. This has been the biggest live stream I've done so far, so this is exciting for me. I think we hit a high point of about 52, 53 people. I haven't checked the stats, but something like that. So very exciting for me. And as I said earlier on, I'll be back in 2 weeks on Valentine's Day to talk about unannounced topic. But as I said earlier on, could well be that we're talking about a new trailer for The Rings of Power. So check that out in 2 weeks' time. But yeah, that's all from me and all from my 2 wonderful guests. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.